Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore, the case of Viviana Parisi and Gioele Mondello. In August 2020 in Italy, where 40-year-old Viviana Parisi lived with her 4-year-old son Gioele and her husband Daniele Mondello in the small town of Venetia. Viviana worked as a DJ in a nightclub. Originally from Turin, she moved to Venetia to be with her husband Daniele, who was also a DJ. Together, they created electronic music and were well-known and successful figures in the local nightlife scene. Both Daniel and Viviana actively maintained social media pages to promote their activities. Viviana frequently shared photos and videos, especially of her son Gioele, portraying their family as happy. However, their online presence was quite public, with Viviana posting clear images of her child's face, which raised concerns about privacy and safety. Some people cautioned Viviana about the potential dangers. On the morning of August 3, 2020, at 9:00 a.m., Daniele and Viviana woke up and had breakfast as usual. They planned to go to the recording studio to work, but Viviana decided to leave later. First, she needed to take her son to buy him new shoes. This means Viviana will have to take her child with her throughout the day to ensure she is supervised. On this day, Viviana forgot her cell phone at home. She prepared some food and got ready to go to work, including a trip to the mall to buy shoes for her son. Viviana and her son left home at around 10:00 a.m. They arrived at the toll booth in Mila and continued their journey along the highway towards Palermo. While passing through the Turde Tunnel on the Messina-Palermo highway, Viviana had an unfortunate accident. Her tire went flat and hit a road service car on the move, in which there were workers. Fortunately, it was not a serious accident. After slowly exiting the tunnel, she stopped in the nearest parking lot, just a few dozen meters from the exit. Several witnesses saw Viviana get out of her Opel. Some approached her to offer help, but she ignored them. They saw that no one was injured, so they eventually left. However, someone called the police to report the situation. The police arrived to inspect the car and found no signs of blood. Inside the car, they found Viviana's money and handbag, but neither Viviana nor Gioele were present. A long time passed. Daniele was at the studio, waiting for her to return from the trip. He tried calling her cell phone several times and left several voice messages, but he did not receive an answer. By evening, when Viviana and her son had not returned, Daniele was worried about her absence, so he went to the police to report her missing. That was when he knew that something had happened to Viviana. The police were investigating the disappearance of Viviana and Gioele because Viviana had been involved in a traffic accident that needed to be resolved. As time passed without any news, her husband became increasingly worried. For 5 days, nothing was heard from Viviana or Gioele. She was reported missing, and the Carabinieri police and volunteers were actively searching for her. Several teams searched the area around the parking lot where Viviana had left her car. On August 8, specially trained dogs joined the search. At around 3:00 p.m., they discovered Viviana Parisi's body, located a kilometer from her abandoned car. She was found hidden in a bush at the foot of the observatory. At the time, drones were used to search, but the bodies were so well hidden that they could not be seen from the air. Only sniffer dogs can detect the smell of a decomposing body. Daniele received the news that devastated him. While Gioele was still missing, Viviana's body was sent for forensic analysis. Unfortunately, the condition of the body was very poor. The body showed multiple injuries. Observers noted obvious bite marks and pieces of flesh attached. A forensic expert pointed out that such injuries could have been caused by wild animals after her death. Viviana suffered multiple fractures, which are common in falls from great heights. She was found at the bottom of a 16-foot-high cliff. In order to gather more information and clarify the situation, the police began investigating Viviana's personal life. During the investigation, they began to suspect that her husband, Daniele, was involved in the incident. However, Viviana's friends and family had only positive things to say about him. Daniele admitted that Viviana had been depressed. She was even hospitalized for a short time, but was discharged shortly after. As a result, she experienced mood swings. Her relatives confirmed her difficulties, but noted that by August, she had shown significant improvement. However, it was difficult for them to fully understand her situation because they lived far away and had never met her in person until now. There is no information about the investigation into whether Viviana may have killed Gioele and then chosen to end her life by jumping off a cliff. Unfortunately, the search efforts were unsuccessful. Even with the help of sniffer dogs and drones, Gioele's body was never found. While examining Viviana's computer, police noticed that she had become increasingly interested in something called the Pyramid of Light, a work of art built using precise mathematical calculations. At the center of the pyramid, there is a spiral path that symbolizes the journey towards light and knowledge. Just days before her disappearance, Viviana had been researching how to get to the Pyramid of Light because she wanted to take her son there to be enlightened. It is important to note that based on her route that morning, she was likely headed to the Pyramid of Light, which was located 100 kilometers from their home. Viviana's recent social media posts hint at feelings of loneliness and reflection on her inner life. She may not have wanted Daniele to know about her journey to the pyramids. After investigation, the police discovered that she had been acting unusually over the past few months. She was often seen with the Bible, seemingly seeking comfort from her fears. She even held the Bible in public places. Things took a strange turn when Viviana publicly read passages from the Bible in front of the church. Viviana's family shared information with the police that Viviana had been acting erratically in the months leading up to her death. Viviana was concerned for her son's safety and sought refuge at the pyramids, but she never showed any intention of harming herself or her son. Police suspect that she may have been thrown to the foot of the tower column where her body was found. As if she had jumped herself, she would have fallen much further than where her body was found. During the investigation, the police found no fingerprints of Viviana on the pylon. If she had actually tried to climb up there to jump, she would have left some traces. In addition, the height of only 5 meters did not seem to be enough to cause her so many fractures. However, the area was home to many wild animals. If these animals were strong enough to move her body, they could easily drag her a considerable distance. During this time, witness accounts collected by the police regarding the Viviana's actions in the parking lot were conflicting. Some witnesses maintained that the Viviana was seen holding the child, while others insisted she got out of the car alone without any child or companion. Additionally, some observers noted that she was carrying a large bag. An elderly couple reported that after the car stopped, 2 people approached Viviana and tried to help her. Police have issued a public alert calling on these 2 people to come forward as they are believed to be important witnesses who could help clarify the circumstances surrounding Viviana's death. Only they can confirm whether the child was actually with Viviana. Police pieced together a timeline of events from the morning of the incident by analyzing surveillance camera footage to track Viviana's movements. They were able to track most of her route along the highway. One particular incident caught their attention. As Viviana approached the highway toll booth, she said she had no money and was asked to pay with a credit card. However, it was clear that she had cash and a credit card with her as she was planning to go shopping. Police found Viviana's behavior very suspicious. After driving past the gas station, they located her at a gas station in a nearby suburb. She had taken a long detour to fill up there, which was unusual as there were several other gas stations along the route. Viviana had no problem paying for the gas as she used cash, unlike at the checkpoint, What was most important to the investigation was that Gioele was still in the car with his mother at this gas station. The boy was alive and well. The gas station attendant reported that everything seemed normal at the time. Just 10 minutes later, an accident occurred in the tunnel. Police believe Gioele may have died in the accident. When Viviana stopped and realized she could no longer help the boy, she may have made the tragic decision to end her own life. This theory was soon dismissed as there was no blood or injuries found in Viviana's car. Another theory was that Daniele may have been a domestic abuser, which led Viviana and her son to choose to escape from him. It is believed that she saw the trip as an opportunity to take the child away from a dangerous husband. However, this idea was quickly dismissed as Daniele was widely regarded as a kind and loving person, and few believed that he could be abusive. Of particular concern is the voicemail on Viviana's phone that Daniele left while searching for her. Unable to reach her, he recorded a reassuring message in which he told her not to worry, that nothing had happened and that they would not do anything to her. This statement suggests that he was comforting her after a troubling event. Daniel said he was worried about Viviana and Gioele, which prompted him to try to reassure her. However, Viviana had left her phone at home, so she could not contact him to explain the situation. This made him even more worried. He did not provide the police with a clear explanation of his concerns or any useful information. However, the police believed he knew more than he was letting on. Meanwhile, the investigation discovered that Viviana had been suffering from severe panic attacks and mental health issues in recent months, for which she had been receiving medication and treatment. Daniele mentioned that Viviana may not have been taking the medication prescribed by her psychiatrist. According to Daniele, she only relied on medications that she was familiar with. As a result, she was in an unstable state with Gioele. This situation could have led to an attack. Viviana clearly endangered Gioele. On August 16, two witnesses who had helped Viviana came to the police station. They turned out to be a married couple. They were unaware of Viviana's death because they did not recognize her in the pictures shown on television. However, when they received word that the police were looking for them, the couple agreed to clarify what had happened during their encounter in the parking lot. Witnesses confirmed that Viviana was holding a child in her arms during the incident. Neither Viviana nor the child appeared to be seriously injured. Witnesses noted that there were no signs of scratches, bruises, or bleeding. The child in Viviana's arms was conscious. The couple then suddenly saw Viviana appear to be in a panic and run away with the child. She held Gioele protectively and ran through the bushes. The two witnesses followed her, believing that something was wrong and that Viviana and the child needed help. However, Viviana quickly fled from them into the dense vegetation, and Viviana did not respond to their calls, causing them to stop searching for her. After the investigation, there were still no further clues leading to Gioele's whereabouts. The police discovered a medical certificate which included a psychiatrist's assessment of Viviana's condition. She had a nervous breakdown and became paranoid. Daniele became desperate when the police failed to find his son. He assembled a team of volunteers, mostly friends and family members. Amazingly, later that evening, while searching the area near where Viviana's body was found, they discovered the body of a baby boy. The condition of the body was tragic. The body was badly decomposed, and some of the bones were missing, likely carried off by wild animals. Because the body was so badly decomposed that identification was impossible, after testing through dental records, they determined the body was Gioele. Unfortunately, the discovery of the body does not bring us any closer to solving the case. Daniele believes this shows negligence on the part of the police. He is baffled as to why they did not find the body sooner, especially since it was already decomposed and was near Viviana's body at the time. After the investigation, the police discovered that Daniele knew about her serious emotional struggles but showed no concern for her or her well-being. Investigations revealed that shortly before her disappearance, he had begun communicating with a divorce lawyer. Viviana found out about his intentions to divorce him. Did this revelation cause her to take such drastic measures? Unfortunately, Joel's autopsy was inconclusive. The cause of his death was never known. In order to find out why the family tried to conceal information about Viviana's illness, the police wiretapped all family members. During the wiretapping, the police discovered that no one in Viviana's family agreed that her cause of death was end his own life. Other than that, nothing suspicious was discussed. Her relatives simply underestimated the severity of her illness. Daniele's family later spoke out. They claimed that the police had conducted a poor search and had not found Joela's body quickly enough, which may have missed important clues. They were confident that Viviana would not have taken her own life or harmed her son, although they admitted that she had struggled with mental health issues of late. At the same time, Viviana's family claimed that someone was chasing her and that she was eventually caught in a remote area where both she and her child were killed. However, that no witnesses reported seeing anyone chasing her. They also noted that Viviana had the opportunity to ask passers-by for help but chose to run away. Despite the family's objections, the investigation decided to close the case. Viviana's family publicly disagreed with the decision, but their request was ignored. Viviana Parisi and Gioela case confirmed as a murder-suicide by scientific police. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kristen Trickle. Kristen Trickle was born on August 14, 1993, in a small town in southeastern Nebraska. However, her early childhood was marked by turmoil. Her biological mother abandoned the family when Kristen was just 3 years old. Despite the challenges, Kristen's father, James, raised her on his own, providing for her every need. Unfortunately, James struggled with a severe and worsening illness. Tragically, he passed away when Kristen was 16 years old. As a result, Kristen was at risk of being sent to a shelter until she turned 18, as there were no other close relatives to care for her. Fortunately, Kristen's aunt and uncle, who lived in Kansas, stepped in to provide a loving home. Although they already had 3 children of their own, they were willing to take in their orphaned niece and give her a comfortable and happy life. Kristen met Colby, a talented young musician, at church. At 18, Colby was already skilled on the guitar and wrote his own songs. He was passionate about building a successful music career. As they spent more time together, Kristen and Colby's friendship blossomed into a romance. Colby's charming personality and musical talents captivated Kristen, and he often wrote songs for her. He was outgoing, friendly, and had a way of making people feel at ease. After graduating from high school, Colby's interests shifted towards the military. He enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces at 18 and went on to serve for 3 years, establishing a solid military career during that time. Colby maintained a close relationship with Kristen, frequently calling and corresponding with her. At 21, he made a surprise decision to join the reserves, returned home, and proposed to Kristen, who happily accepted. They got married in April 2014. After their wedding, Colby and Kristen settled in Hays, Kansas, where Colby completed his college education and pursued a music career, albeit with limited success. He performed at local events and parties, playing cover versions of popular songs. They had 2 dogs, which they loved dearly, and many people considered their marriage to be happy. However, tragedy struck 5 years into their marriage. On Halloween Eve, October 31, 2019, at around 4 a.m., a distress call was made to emergency services. The caller, who identified himself as Colby Kristen, reported that his wife, Kristen, had shot herself in the head with a revolver that was kept in their home. When medical help and the police arrived at the scene, a young man opened the front door for the officers, but stayed outside himself. Inside, the team found Kristen, who appeared to be surprisingly calm despite the severity of the situation. When the officers entered the bedroom, they found a woman, Kristen, lying on the bed in a pool of her own blood. A large revolver was on her abdomen, and she had a visible gunshot wound on her chin. At first, it seemed like she had already died, but surprisingly, she moved her hand, and an officer detected a weak pulse and breathing. The officers moved Kristen to the adjacent room to position her on the floor for resuscitation attempts. Despite their efforts, Kristen had died by the time the ambulance arrived, and the medical team confirmed her death. Sergeant Brandon Hotman went outside to inform Colby, Kristen's husband, that she had passed away. Colby repeatedly asked if Hotman was sure, and when he was told the truth, he broke down in tears. However, his behavior and tears seemed insincere, given that just minutes earlier, he had been chatting casually with other patrolmen about video games. At first glance, the scene suggested that she had taken her own life, but experienced detectives quickly suspected that something was amiss. It was the eve of Halloween, and she had been preparing for the celebration, which made her apparent decision to end her life all the more puzzling. The detectives found handmade costume decorations on her vanity and themed treats in the kitchen, including lollipop bats and ghosts, gummy worms, and other sweets. This suggested that she had been looking forward to the holiday, which made her death even more unexpected. She was found nearly undressed, wearing only her underwear, which was unusual. Typically, women take care to present themselves in a way that they would want to be seen, even in death. Furthermore, the method of death, a gunshot to the head, was also uncharacteristic of a woman. This method is often avoided by women due to concerns about disfiguring themselves. Kristen's body was severely damaged. One of the most puzzling aspects of her death was the gun itself. The large revolver would have been difficult for Kristen to handle due to her small size and fragile nature. It would have been hard for her to hold the gun, let alone twist her arm to shoot herself in the chin. The position of the gun also raised questions for the officer, as it was lying on her stomach, pointing sideways. Kristen's husband later explained that after finding her, he too had considered taking his own life. He held the revolver to his temple but then changed his mind and called emergency services, hoping to save his wife. At the scene of the crime, detectives were surprised when the victim's phone, which was sitting on a nightstand, rang with an alarm. It turned out that she had set the alarm to remind herself of plans for the morning, but it seemed that she had changed her mind and taken her own life during the night. This unusual detail raised suspicions, and detectives thought that someone might have staged the scene to look like a suicide. As a result, the victim's husband, Colby, became the main suspect and was asked to come to the police station for questioning. He agreed to go willingly. When Colby arrived at the police station, he seemed upset but not overly distraught. He remained calm and confident as he explained what had happened the previous evening. According to Colby, his wife Kristen, a manager at Walmart who was expecting a promotion, had come home from work and they had played video games together. Then, he went to bed early because he wasn't feeling well. Kristen had gone to the kitchen to finish preparing holiday treats, leaving Colby to sleep. But in the middle of the night, a loud bang jolted Colby awake. The sudden noise left him dazed and disoriented, his ears ringing, and he couldn't see anything in the darkness. When he finally turned on the light, he was shocked to find his wife Kristen lying motionless beside him, her head bleeding severely. Strangely enough, if it's true as stated by Colby, he attempted to revive his wife, but soon realized it was hopeless. He then picked up a revolver, put it to his own head, but ultimately set it back down on her body. He called emergency services and went outside to wait for the police. This sequence of events raises several questions. For example, Why did he place the gun on her abdomen instead of disposing of it elsewhere? It's also unclear why he waited outside for the police and medics if he thought his wife might still be alive. In situations like this, people usually try to save the person's life or apply pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding. However, Colby did not attempt to help his wife again, claiming he was in shock. While a police officer was trying to provide first aid before the medics arrived, he did not show any interest in his wife's condition. Instead, he stood outside and casually chatted with a police officer about music and video games. When Colby learned of Kristen's death, he briefly teared up, but quickly composed himself. At the police station, he answered routine questions, including whether Kristen had life insurance, which he denied. However, he mentioned that he was eligible for minor payouts from his time in the armed forces. During the conversation, Colby began boasting about his military accomplishments, claiming to have worked in intelligence and participated in special operations worldwide. Despite sounding credible, Colby's claims were largely false. When asked why he thought Kristen might have taken her own life, he attributed it to her long history of depression, which stemmed from a traumatic childhood and adolescence. He cited her mother's betrayal, her father's death, and her forced relocation to live with an uncle and aunt she had never met before as contributing factors. Colby's words seemed convincing, but experienced investigators sensed he was lying and had possibly rehearsed his story. Despite their suspicions, they had no concrete evidence to charge him with a crime, so they had to release him. Kristen's family was shocked and devastated by her death. Her uncle, aunt, and siblings immediately traveled 500 miles to speak with the police and make funeral arrangements. They strongly believed that Kristen would never have taken her own life, citing her strong religious faith and regular church attendance. According to her family, Kristen was a happy and optimistic person who loved life and had big plans for the future. She had even been working on opening a shelter for homeless animals and had found a property she wanted to lease. Investigations confirmed that Kristen had been planning to rent a new property and was expecting a promotion at work, which she was proud of. She was also preparing for Halloween and had promised to visit her sister for her birthday in November. Her relatives stated that she had no history of depression or mental health issues and did not have any harmful habits. Her family also emphasized that Kristen would never abandon her dogs, which she loved dearly. They suspected that her husband, Colby, might have been involved in her disappearance. They described Colby as a controlling and cruel man who dictated whom Kristen could interact with and would become enraged if she didn't respond to his calls or messages immediately. He prohibited her from contacting her relatives, but she would secretly call them from her husband's home. Visits with her family were infrequent. During her last visit, she confided in them that she could no longer endure the mistreatment and had discussed it with her husband. She warned that if things didn't improve, they would have to separate. The autopsy of Kristen revealed a single bullet wound on her chin, which suggested that the shot was fired while she was on her back with the gun pressed to her head. While it was possible that she could have shot herself, it would have been very difficult to do so. There were no signs of struggle or resistance on her body. The detectives, however, were not convinced. Given Colby's history of controlling behavior, they suspected that he might have been violent towards Kristen in the past. They conducted a thorough examination of Kristen's body, looking for any signs of bruises, abrasions, or scratches that might indicate a history of abuse. Despite their efforts, no internal or external injuries were found, aside from the gunshot wound. The investigation then shifted its focus to Colby's personality, revealing that he was a habitual liar who frequently deceived others and even himself with convincing falsehoods. Colby's story didn't add up. Despite his claims of being in danger and having connections to intelligence, he had no history of being in high-risk situations or working with intelligence agencies. In fact, he had been dishonest with those around him about his music career and income. In reality, his wife Kristen was the primary breadwinner, working hard to support their family. Colby, on the other hand, only played occasional gigs during holidays and spent most of his time playing video games. He had talent, but lacked the persistence and patience to succeed, and his laziness held him back. The police investigation uncovered some information. A search of Colby and Kristen gadgets revealed a revealing look at their lives. Kristen's phone calendar was filled with appointments, from haircuts to meetings with a real estate agent. Meanwhile, Colby's messages showed that he had been flirting with another woman, even while at the police station. He had exchanged messages on a laptop in the living room, raising suspicions about his honesty. A recovered search history also revealed that Colby had been researching life insurance payouts in the event of death shortly before the tragedy. This discovery raised more questions about Colby's motives and potential involvement in the events that unfolded. An investigation revealed that Colby had lied about his financial situation. He had taken out 2 insurance policies on his wife, naming himself as the beneficiary in the event of her death. These policies included military spouse insurance and a standard life insurance policy, with payouts that were much higher than Colby had initially claimed. In fact, he had calculated exactly how much he would receive if his wife died. Despite the suspicious circumstances and Colby's inconsistent statements, the case ultimately hinged on the forensic expert's report. The report concluded that there were no signs of violence on the body, except for a single gunshot wound, suggesting that Kristen may have taken her own life. The case was eventually closed, and Colby received the insurance payouts, nearly $50,000 from the military spouse insurance and over $100,000 from the life insurance policy. On the same day the money was deposited into his account, Colby ordered a life-sized realistic doll from an online store, apparently for intimate purposes. Colby indulged in a lavish lifestyle, buying a new gaming console, an electric guitar, and expensive musical equipment. He spent the rest of the money on fancy clothes and frequent nights out at bars and restaurants, feeling carefree and convinced that he had gotten away with the crime since there was no evidence against him. For nearly 2 years, Colby lived a life of luxury, but in the summer of 2021, a new district prosecutor took office and reopened the investigation into Colby's wife's disappearance. Detectives had approached the prosecutor, convinced that Colby had murdered his wife. They presented evidence, including the restored browser history, Colby's unusual behavior, and his clear motive. After reviewing the case, the prosecutor authorized the reopening of the investigation. In July 2021, Colby was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated homicide and intentionally misleading the investigation. During his arrest, he remained calm and immediately contacted his lawyers, who began working on his defense. Colby's defense team argued that his wife had suffered from chronic depression for many years and that her disappearance was inevitable. They also portrayed Colby as a loving and caring husband, a valorous serviceman, and a devout person, contradicting the detective's suspicions. The prosecution took a unique approach by hiring experienced specialists to create a psychological profile of the deceased and examine her emotional state leading up to the tragedy. This method, known as a psychological autopsy, involved analyzing data from Kristen's phone, social media posts, recent photos, and interviews with her relatives, friends, and colleagues. After months of gathering and analyzing information, the experts reached a clear conclusion: Kristen had no intention of ending her life, given her short-term and long-term plans. The trial and verdict in this complex case were delayed, starting in September 2023, nearly 4 years after the tragedy. Although the defendant had a clear motive, acted suspiciously, and lied during interrogations, the forensic expert's initial conclusion initially worked in his favor. The prosecution had obtained a new report that could potentially change the course of the case. When questioned about the insurance inquiries on his computer, Colby claimed that his wife had likely made them to find out the payout amount. However, the timing of the requests contradicted his statement, as his wife was at work at the time, confirmed by surveillance footage. Colby was also asked about a life-size doll he had purchased shortly after his wife's death, as well as other expensive items. He explained that he couldn't sleep alone and needed something to hold on to, and that he bought the console and guitar to take his mind off his grief. His mother backed up his claims, vigorously defending her son throughout the trial. The psychiatrist's crucial evaluation revealed that Kristen had not intentionally ended her own life. This detailed assessment was instrumental in determining the events surrounding her death. The autopsy report revealed an unusual aspect: the angle at which the bullet entered Kristen's chin was peculiar. The forensic analysis indicated that the bullet was fired from the left side of Kristen, contradicting her dominant right-handedness. This raises questions about whether someone standing on Kristen's left side pulled the trigger or if she shot herself with her left hand. The latter is less plausible considering Kristen was a right-handed individual. This vital evidence raises serious concerns about Colby's potential involvement in Kristen's death. After deliberating the case, the jury unanimously delivered a guilty verdict, finding Colby guilty of all charges. Consequently, Colby received a life imprisonment sentence, eligible for parole after a minimum of 50 years. Notably, Colby refused to accept his guilt, despite being given ample opportunity. Throughout his appeals process, all of his attempts to refute his sentence were ultimately unsuccessful. In the end, no modifications were ever made to Kristen's official cause of death report. Hey detectives! Welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Lisa Harnum. Lisa Harnum was born on June 12, 1981, in the Toronto suburbs of Canada. She was the second child in her family, raised by her single mother, Joanna, along with her older brother, Jason. The two siblings were extremely close, but their father's departure when they were very young left them with no memories of him. Growing up, Lisa was a lively and driven young girl with a strong passion for sports. She spent much of her childhood actively in various activities with her brother, including martial arts and team sports like soccer and volleyball. However, her true love was ballet. She spent hours each day at the dance studio, practicing rigorously. As she was naturally tall and slender from a young age, she initially seemed suited for ballet. Nevertheless, her professional ballet training required an extremely strict diet, which ultimately took a toll on her growing body. Lisa struggled with anorexia, an eating disorder, during her teenage years. She initially kept her condition a secret, believing she could handle the problem on her own. However, as her weight dropped to a critically low level, her mother intervened and admitted her to a clinic for treatment. Lisa spent several months in rehabilitation, focusing on regaining her health and weight. After completing her high school education, Lisa pursued her passion for dance and decided to explore a career in the beauty industry. Alongside her university studies, she worked as a perfumer for a large cosmetics chain. In her free time, she honed her makeup and hairdressing skills. In 2005, after celebrating his 24th birthday, Lisa felt an overwhelming desire for change. She wanted to leave Canada and move to Australia. Two primary reasons drove this decision. She craved a warmer climate and was eager to explore the world. To make the move possible, Lisa obtained a one-year work visa and traveled to Australia. Her mother accompanied her initially, staying for the first few months to ensure Lisa settled into her new surroundings. Once satisfied that her daughter was capable of taking care of herself, her mother returned to Toronto. Lisa made the decision to stay in Sydney permanently after her initial visa expired. To achieve this, she first extended her stay for another year. During this time, she gathered the necessary documents to apply for Australian citizenship. Outside of work, Lisa faces her own personal problems. Due to not having a father figure in her childhood, she often found herself attracted to older men. She often seeks concern from more mature men. Lisa's personal and professional life began to fall into place when she landed a job at a Sydney cosmetics company in 2006. She soon started dating a coworker who was nearly twice her age. As their relationship progressed, they decided to move in together, and Lisa relocated to his apartment. A few months later, they took the next step, and Lisa introduced her boyfriend to her mother and brother. And they accepted her choice. The couple traveled extensively, visiting destinations like the Seychelles and Paris, and even attending Rio de Janeiro's famous carnival. At one point, the man proposed to Lisa, and she happily accepted. However, their engagement was short-lived. About a year later, the couple broke up. While Lisa didn't reveal the specific reasons for their split, but she hinted that their age difference was a major factor. In 2010, Lisa completed her education at the Sydney College of Stylists. She secured a job as a hairdresser at a well-known beauty salon, where she quickly gained the respect of her colleagues and the trust of her clients. During this time, Lisa starts dating a new boyfriend. However, it came to a swift end when she discovered he was married. As she didn't want to damage someone else's family, she ended the relationship promptly. Before the breakup, he introduced Lisa to a businessman named Simon Gitney at a party. Unfortunately, this introduction had severe consequences for Lisa. Simon Gitney was born in December 1973 in Maryland to an immigrant family from Lebanon who held strong religious beliefs. His parents raised Simon and his 5 siblings with a firm hand. Despite this, Simon struggled with managing his emotions from a young age, frequently experiencing intense anger outbursts and displaying possessive tendencies. He could not stand rejection and often resorted to violence. Simon's behavior eventually landed him in trouble with the law. Simon's first experience in jail occurred when he was 18 years old. He showed up at his ex-girlfriend's workplace and began harassing her, prompting the store owner to intervene and throw him out. Undeterred, Simon returned with friends and attacked the store owner. Simon physically assaulted him. As a result, Simon was jailed, but only served a short sentence and was eventually released on bail due to good behavior. 3 years later, Simon was arrested again, this time for robbery. Then he resisted arrest. A physical altercation broke out and he bit off part of a police officer's ear. This act put him at risk of a serious prison sentence. Fortunately, the pastor of his family's church intervened on his behalf, which led to Simon serving only a year and a half in prison. Years later, in 2000, Simon got into trouble with the law once more. He was arrested for possessing and distributing illegal substances. Despite the severity of the crime, but he received a relatively lenient sentence and served only 2 years. After his release, Simon appeared to turn his life around. He relocated to Sydney and co-founded a successful luxury women's shoe business with some friends. The business generated a substantial and steady income, quickly making Simon wealthy. He purchased a luxurious home in an upscale neighborhood and a high-end vehicle. Simon made a concerted effort to conceal his troubled past from those around him, including roommates and romantic partners. Simon and Lisa had exchanged numbers at a party, and he soon followed up with a call. They started with casual conversations. But over time these talks developed into a romance. In January 2010, Lisa confided in Simon about her dissatisfaction with her current living situation. She expressed a desire to rent an apartment in a different neighborhood. Simon generously offered her a temporary place to stay in his luxury apartment, rent-free, while she searched for a new home. Despite initial reservations from Lisa's mother, Joanna, Lisa reassured her that the arrangement was temporary and that she and Simon were just friends. At the time, Lisa assumed Simon was gay because he takes great care of his looks and used piercings, but this assumption proved to be incorrect. For the initial 2 months, Simon maintained a reserved distance from Lisa. They lived in separate rooms, and there wasn't even a hint of intimacy between them. But over time, they became closer, the so-called spark burned, and they started dating. When they began dating, Simon was 37 and Lisa was 28. To Lisa, Simon seemed perfect, charming, sociable, and generous. He frequently surprised her with gifts and pleasant experiences, causing her to see him as a prince in a fairy tale. As a couple, they began attending social events together, especially at an elite sports club that Simon frequents. Lisa genuinely believed she had found her soulmate and was convinced that she would spend the rest of her life happily with Simon. She happily shared her feelings with her mother, brother, and friends, but she remained oblivious to the fact that her fairy tale would soon come to an end. 6 months into their relationship, Simon's behavior began to shift in subtle ways that Lisa didn't notice at first. Unaware of the manipulation, she thinks that Simon is doing everything just for her good. However, he slowly isolated her from her friends and family, disregarded her personal boundaries, and attempted to alter her perspectives, tastes, and behavior to align with his own desires. In June 2010, shortly after Lisa's 29th birthday, Simon started pressuring her to leave her job at the beauty salon. He said that she wasn't appreciated there and she could find a higher-paying job elsewhere. However, Lisa enjoyed her work and had many loyal clients. She was also satisfied with her income and didn't see a reason to quit, so she refused Simon's suggestion. Simon was not satisfied with Lisa's decision. In August, he took drastic action. He showed up at her salon, causing a huge scandal, forcing her to quit. Despite Lisa was shocked and disappointed by Simon's behavior, but he convinced her that she no longer needed to work, as his income would be enough to support them both comfortably. He reassured her that they could afford anything they wanted and live a life of luxury. A month and a half later, Simon and Lisa moved into a high-end apartment on the 15th floor of an elite residential complex. Unbeknownst to Lisa, the apartment was filled with hidden surveillance cameras, allowing Simon to monitor her every move. He further tightened his grip on her by giving her a smartphone and laptop that he had pre-installed with spyware. The spyware enabled Simon to track Lisa's messages, emails, calls, and movements. He also gained access to her social media accounts, which he manipulated by deleting posts and photos, reading her private correspondence, and controlling her friend list. As time passed, Simon's control over Lisa grew, but he cleverly made it seem as though she was making her own decisions. In reality, he had invaded every aspect of her life, leaving her with no sense of privacy. Simon exerted control over Lisa's appearance by prohibiting her from wearing cosmetics, deeming her makeup too bold and unrefined. He also purchased unflattering clothing in dark colors, discarding her existing wardrobe due to its revealing nature, which he believed would attract unwanted male attention. Lisa's movements were restricted as well. Simon would only allow her to leave the apartment if he accompanied her, and even then, they only visited places he had selected. He also barred her from going to the gym, instead buying her expensive exercise equipment for home use, citing this as a suitable alternative. Simon's control extended to Lisa's social life, causing her to lose connections on social media. As her online connections dwindled, Simon eventually convinced her to delete her accounts altogether. Lisa had lost touch with her friends, and her interactions were under constant surveillance. The only people she was allowed to communicate with were her mother and brother, with Simon's permission. When Christmas 2010 approached, Lisa planned a trip home to Canada to spend the holiday with her family. Initially, Simon intended to join her, but then because he was busy with work, he couldn't go with her. Despite his reservations, Lisa persuaded him to let her travel alone, as she had not seen her loved ones in over a year. Simon eventually agreed, but only on the condition that she adhere to a strict set of rules he had established for her trip. Her brother Jason and her mother, Joanna, were shocked by the transformation in Lisa over the past year. Gone was the bright and cheerful beauty she once was. Her appearance had changed in every way. Without makeup, her face was barely recognizable. Her luxurious hair is tied into a ponytail and hidden under a headpiece. Her clothes were now baggy, unflattering, and black. However, it was not just her physical appearance that was alarming. Lisa's behavior had also changed significantly. She would flinch with anxiety every time the phone rang and rush to answer it instantly. This was because Simon had made it a condition for her. She had to be available to answer his calls at any time, no matter what she was doing. Lisa always stayed at her mother's house, refused to see her friends, and almost never went out, causing her mother Joanna to become extremely concerned. Joanna decided it was time to have an honest conversation with Lisa to understand why she was behaving this way. During this conversation, Lisa broke down in tears and confessed that her boyfriend Simon constantly monitored her activities, knowing who she associated with, who she talked to on the phone, and what they discussed. Lisa also revealed that Simon controlled many aspects of her life, forbidding her from working, seeing friends, going to the gym, or have any preferences. As a result, she had lost touch with all of her friends. Lisa's mother was shocked and urged her to stay in Canada, pointing out that she had no ties in Australia. However, Lisa was resolute, explaining that she loved Simon and didn't want to end their relationship. She believed their issues were temporary, given they'd only been together for less than a year, and that he would eventually calm down and become less controlling. Lisa was also convinced that Simon genuinely cared for her and wanted the best for her. Despite her family's concerns and efforts to persuade her that the relationship was unhealthy, Lisa decided to return to Australia to be with Simon. Lisa tried to ease her mother's concerns by telling her that Simon cared for her and wouldn't cause her harm. However, when Lisa went back, things took a turn for the worse. Simon restricted her from leaving their apartment and even demanded that she avoid eye contact with other men when they were out in public, insisting she keep her gaze on the ground. Furthermore, Simon started referring to Lisa by her middle name, Cecilia, because he thought it sounded more polite that way. In the spring of 2011, Lisa started experiencing pain in her leg due to an old ballet injury from her youth. Instead of taking her to a hospital, Simon arranged for a female physical therapist to visit their home 3 times a week to treat her with massages. Over time, the therapist became Lisa's closest friend and confidant, someone she trusted and shared her difficult situation with. On June 12, Lisa's 30th birthday, Simon organized a party at Sydney's most expensive restaurant, but the guest list only included his own family and close friends. Lisa was not given the opportunity to invite any of her own friends or acquaintances. As the evening came to a close, Simon surprised her by proposing and placing a ring on her finger. Lisa accepted, but her reaction was not what would have been expected. Instead of tears of happiness, she began crying tears of desperation and hopelessness. Back home, Lisa called her mother to share the news of her engagement, but her excitement quickly turned to worry as she began to sob on the phone. However, her mother, Joanna, was far from thrilled. Joanna immediately expressed her disapproval of the engagement and urged Lisa to end the relationship and return to Canada as soon as possible. Lisa pleaded with her mother to stop discussing the matter over the phone, because Simon might be eavesdropping on their conversation. Lisa tries to distract herself with thoughts about their upcoming wedding. However, when she tried to discuss the plans with Simon, he abruptly interrupted her and declared that he would make all the decisions, including choosing the venue, buying her wedding dress, and creating the guest list. This left Lisa feeling devastated and powerless. Feeling lost, she confided in her physiotherapist during a visit, confessing that she couldn't continue in the relationship but felt trapped because Simon wouldn't allow her to leave. Lisa and the masseuse devised a secret plan. Each time the masseuse visited, Lisa discreetly gave her some of her possessions for safekeeping, making sure Simon didn't suspect a thing. On July 28, Simon left his laptop behind in the rush, an unusual mistake since he always carried it with him. Seizing the opportunity, Lisa accessed the laptop and discovered her worst fears. She found a spyware program that allowed Simon to monitor all the data from her phone. Lisa was discovered recordings of her conversations with her mother and surveillance footage from cameras in every room of their apartment. Fearing for her well-being, Lisa used the masseuse's phone to call her mother and ask her to get on the next flight to her apartment and take she home. However, Joanna was unable to leave work immediately, as she had to arrange a shift swap with a colleague. Joanna would later deeply regret the delay this. Upon returning home, Simon quickly discovered that Lisa had accessed his laptop and seen the spyware. Lisa broke down in tears, struggling to understand why she deserved to be treated this way. However, Simon justified his actions, saying they were for her own good. The following day, July 29th, a heated conversation took place between Simon and Lisa, which was later presented in court as evidence. During this conversation, Lisa became emotional and asked if she could go home. In contrast, Simon remained calm and spoke with confidence, assuring her that returning home was not an option. He then told Lisa to calm down and suggested that she had mental issues. On the morning of July 30th, 2011, Lisa woke up early, dressed neatly, and put papers and necessary items in her purse. Before leaving, she locked herself in the bathroom to make a disturbing phone call to her mother. During the call, Lisa said her mother that if anything were to happen to her, her fiancé, Simon, would be responsible. Lisa's intention was to exit the apartment without waking Simon, but she was unsuccessful. The incidents that followed are unclear, and the incident details remain a mystery. However, neighbors reported hearing a scream in the hallway, which stopped abruptly before they could react. Just 1 minute later, a young woman, later confirmed to be Lisa, fell from the balcony of the 15th floor in her fatal crash to the ground below. She landed on the ground, where she died instantly from her severe injuries. Several people on the street saw this happen, but it occurred so quickly that they didn't have time to fully understand the situation. However, one eyewitness, a man who was walking his dog nearby, provided more details. He said that he heard a noise and looked up to see a man holding something large. This man then dropped the object, which turned out to be Lisa. 3 minutes later, Simon, dressed in his pajamas, ran into the street, overcome with tears. He expressed despair about his future, insisting he had been too late to stop Lisa. Initially, the situation seemed like an accident, but Simon swiftly contradicted this assumption, announced that Lisa had ended her own life. Further investigation revealed a cryptic note in Simon's pocket and a disturbing video recording further complicated the situation. After the body Lisa was brought to the morgue and examined, some clues have been found. Upon searching the pockets, investigators found fragments of a torn note containing the message, "There are cameras everywhere in the apartment." It's likely that Lisa had broken the note into small pieces and scattered them across different pockets to prevent Simon from finding them. Further investigation revealed that the apartment indeed had multiple cameras, but the hard drive containing the footage was missing. However, Simon maintained that there were no video recordings at all. A surveillance camera in the apartment's hallway recorded a disturbing scene. Approximately 1 minute before Lisa's fatal fall, the footage shows her desperately running out of the apartment and calling for help. However, Simon quickly grabs her from behind, covers her mouth, and forcibly drags her back inside. This incident is believed to be connected to the scream heard by the neighbors. Investigators also discovered evidence on Simon's laptop, including a recorded conversation he and Lisa had the night before her death, as well as spyware software he used to secretly monitor her activities. Simon stated that he and Lisa had a disagreement that morning, resulting in her becoming hysterical. She initially fled to the hallway, screaming, but he calmed her down by bringing her back inside, fearing a scene in front of the neighbors. Moments later, as Simon was about to call Lisa's mother on the phone, Lisa went out to the balcony and fell. Simon claimed that Lisa once mentioned ending her own life, but he had not taken her threat seriously. He explained that his decision to install spyware was largely driven by his genuine concern for Lisa's well-being and safety. During the trial, Simon was accompanied by his new girlfriend, Rachel Louise, 22 years old, a model who bore a striking resemblance to Lisa. However, it was later suggested that Rachel simply wanted to make a name for herself through this case, so she was willing to talk to the press and appear on television, claiming Simon would never harm a woman. Meanwhile, Simon's lawyers presented a defense that suggested Lisa had a history of mental health struggles, including anxiety and anorexia, for which she had received treatment at a clinic. They imply that these things were the cause of her death. The defense argued that Simon was of short stature, so he could not have lifted Lisa himself, because she was taller than him, thus he would not have been able to throw her off the balcony. However, a trainer from Simon's gym disputed this claim, stating that Simon lifts heavy weights, so he is much stronger than he looks and can easily lift Lisa. This assertion was supported by the absence of Lisa's fingerprints on the railing and glass barrier, suggesting she could not have jumped on her own as she would have needed to lean on them. The physiotherapist who had treated Lisa took the stand, providing crucial testimony about the abuse Lisa had suffered and the items she had left behind in an attempt to escape. This testimony played a crucial role in the trial. As a result, Simon Gidney was convicted of murdering his fiancée, Lisa Harnham, and sentenced to 26 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. Following the verdict, Rachel Louise became enraged, insulting the judge, and was subsequently removed from the courtroom. Simon and his lawyers made multiple attempts to contest the court's ruling, but they were unsuccessful, and the original verdict stood. Following the verdict, Rachel broke up with Simon. She said in an interview that they found it difficult to maintain a relationship because he was in prison, although she continues to believe in Simon's innocence. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case. The case of Ada Betty Quadros Fernandez. Ada Betty Quadros Fernandez was born on September 13, 1977, in the coastal town of Chimbote, Peru. She was the first child of Victor Quadros, a veterinarian, and Fernandez, a teacher. Ada was the eldest of 4 siblings and consistently performed well academically, even winning knowledge contests. She had a happy childhood filled with dreams of self-improvement. Ada later recounted that she spent much of her childhood with one of her sisters on their grandparents' farm, enjoying the close connection with nature and animals. This period on the farm was one of the happiest times of her life. Ada came from a family that was not poor but also not wealthy. As a teenager, she looked for ways to contribute financially to her family. Together with her sister and a friend, she formed a group to entertain at children's parties. After high school, Ada enrolled in a private university to study law. However, her financial situation did not allow her to continue, and she had to drop out. Despite this setback, Ada remained determined to succeed and support her family. With this goal in mind, she applied for a U.S. visa. Like many young people from Peru and other Latin American countries, Ada saw the United States as a land of opportunities. She was determined to move there, work hard, earn a better income, and pave the way for a brighter future for herself and her family. Her family enthusiastically supported her decision. They sold some of their belongings and did everything they could to gather enough money for her journey. Her destination was Texas, where she initially planned to stay with some relatives. In early 2004, she started working as a waitress in a restaurant. Later, she joined a company that placed nannies in households. It was through this job that she met the Lazarchik family. The Lazarchik family consisted of Father Michael, generally known as Mike, Mother Renee, their oldest daughter Alyssa, and the twin boys Ryan and Kyle. Little is known about the family background, except that they got married in 2000. Soon after their wedding, Renee became pregnant with their first child, Alyssa. After Alyssa's birth, they were expecting twins, Kyle and Ryan. The Lazarchik couple wanted to hire a trustworthy babysitter to take care of the twins when Renee went back to work. Alyssa was already attending a daycare where she had made several friends, so they decided she would continue being cared for there. They interviewed several candidates, and Ada stood out as the best option. She was young, but not a teenager. She appeared healthy, strong, polite, and cheerful. Renee wanted Ada to start immediately so that she could work with her for a few weeks and explain the household routines, the state of affairs, and her expectations. She also wanted to see how Ada would take care of the twins. The family had a specific requirement. They wanted assurances that Ada would stay with them for 18 months, and Ada agreed to this arrangement. Initially, they was agreed that she would spend only daytime hours in the Lazarchik household, but after some time they asked her to move in, and Ada agreed. Everything appeared to progress well. The Lazarchik family was satisfied with her work and grew fond of her, placing complete trust in her. Numerous photographs documented joyful moments with the smiling young nanny holding the twins. However, the situation changed dramatically in the summer of 2005. Ada informed the Lazarchik family that her relatives were returning to Peru before relocating to Germany. Ada was prepared to accompany them and had already purchased her plane ticket for October 29th of that year. Understandably, this came as disappointing news for the couple, as it was not in line with their previous agreement. Eventually, they understood and simply asked Ada to stay until they could find a replacement. They even requested her help in searching for and selecting her successor. Ada agreed, but from that moment on, she no longer stayed overnight at the Lazarchik's house. Instead, she returned to her uncle's house at night and came back early in the morning. Given the change in circumstances and Ada's impending departure, the Lazarchik family scheduled interviews with several nanny candidates on October 12th. During the day, Renee called Ada and asked her to prepare macaroni and cheese for the children. Ada fulfilled the request and fed the children. When Renee returned home, she greeted her children, saw that they were fine, and after interviewing the candidates, spent more than an hour with her little ones before they went to bed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Kyle typically woke up crying at 5 a.m. on Thursday, October 13th. Twins usually sleep heavily and require someone to wake them, but Kyle woke up on his own. Renee got up, went to the twins' room, picked up Kyle, and soothed him until he fell back asleep. She then returned to bed. 2 hours later, at 7:30, Mike went to the kids' room, woke them up, hugged and kissed them, and left them in Renee's care before going to work. She changed Ryan's diaper, said goodbye to twins, and went to work. The kids were fine, nothing out of the ordinary, except for Kyle's early waking that day. His older sister, Alyssa, went to daycare as usual, but things took a dramatic turn around 1 p.m. when Ada called 911, very agitated, saying that one of the kids, Kyle, had stopped breathing and was turning blue. According to the information provided, the operator gave instructions on how to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the child. The person carried out the instructions until the emergency medical responders arrived. After a few minutes, they reached the house and took over the care of Kyle. They asked Ada what had happened, and she, very upset, explained that after lunch she had put Kyle down for a nap and returned to get his brother. But when she came back with Ryan, Kyle began vomiting and stopped breathing. While the paramedics were attending to Kyle, Ada called Renee to inform her of the situation, giving her a different version of the events. She said that after feeding the children, she took Kyle out of the high chair and, as usual, placed him on the playroom floor while she looked for his brother. But when she returned, Kyle was vomiting. She went to the kitchen to get a bowl to collect the vomit, and when she came back, Kyle had fallen. She said she picked him up, took him to the sink, and performed the maneuver that Renee had taught her in case any of the children stopped breathing, but it didn't work, and she also tried CPR. The paramedics transported Kyle to the nearest hospital after the initial treatment. When Renee arrived home, the ambulance with her son had already left, but the police were still on the scene. Renee took Ryan, the other twin, and asked Ada to accompany them. They followed the police, who escorted them to the hospital. During the trip, Renee called her husband, and they met at the medical center. A couple of minutes later, the doctors decided to transfer Kyle by helicopter to the Children's Hospital of Dallas. The Lazarchik family returned home, leaving Ada in charge of Ryan, and headed to the Children's Hospital of Dallas. Ada asked them to keep her informed about Kyle's condition. On the way to the hospital, Renee began to worry that Ada might be too anxious to properly care for Ryan, so she called a friend to help the babysitter at the house. Ada, visibly distressed and crying, opened the door for Rena's friend shortly after the friend arrived at the house. The friend asked Ada to explain what had happened. According to Ada's account, Kyle had suddenly collapsed while standing between the playroom and the kitchen. Ada said she dropped the plate she was holding, picked up Kyle, took him to the living room, and performed CPR on him. Ada mentioned that Kyle's brain hadn't fully developed and that this issue had started at birth. The friend didn't fully understand, but Ada kept talking, expressing her love for Kyle and assuring that she would never hurt him. The friend tried to calm her, reassuring her that she hadn't done anything wrong and that she was a good person. In the meantime, at the Dallas Children's Hospital, the Lazarchik family received devastating news. The doctor in charge of Kyle informed that the child had suffered severe head injuries, with multiple contusions on the head, left arm, and shoulder. A neurosurgeon met with the distressed parents to explain that something needed to be done to relieve the pressure on Kyle's brain, although survival was unlikely. A child abuse specialist who also met with Mike and Renee suggested that Kyle's injuries could be consistent with abuse. The specialist stated that Kyle's injuries were so severe, it was as if he had been in a car accident or fallen from a sixth-floor window. Renee initially found it hard to believe what had happened. She thought Ada might have accidentally dropped the child or was too scared or ashamed to admit it. However, the doctors clearly explained the severity of Kyle's head injuries and the amount of force required to cause them. Given this information, the possibility of an accident seemed unlikely. Renee promptly contacted another friend to pick up Ryan and remove him from the house. While this was happening in the hospital, Ada became increasingly anxious at home. Renee's friend had to go out to pick up her son from school and take him home. During her absence, Ada called her several times, asking if there was any news about Kyle. When Renee's friend returned to the house, she found Ada calm. Ada was no longer crying or talking. Shortly after, a police cart passed by the house. Seeing it, Ada lost her composure. She began to cry uncontrollably and scream, "No, no, no," collapsing on the floor behind a door and repeatedly insisting that she would never harm Kyle. Two female detectives arrived to interview Ada. She was the only adult present when the incident occurred. As the detectives located the house and got out of their patrol car, they heard Ada's cries. Upon entering, they found her extremely agitated. During the interview, the other officer called the hospital to get an update on Kyle's condition. When they discovered the diagnosis, the detectives told Ada that her story did not explain Kyle's injuries. Ada suggested that Kyle may have hit his head when he fell after she left him alone in the playroom, but the officers pointed out that the playroom floor was covered in soft carpets, making this explanation unlikely. When trying to offer another explanation, Ada said that Kyle may have hit his head on the doorframe when she was carrying him on her hip. In the officer's insistence, Ada showed how Kyle could have hurt himself and mentioned that Mike and Renee often hit Kyle's head without any problem. The officer checked the place where Ada claimed Kyle hit his head, but found no evidence of a strong impact. When the officers told her that the injury did not seem serious enough to have caused the extensive damage described by the doctors, Ada insisted that the impact was strong because she was running with Kyle in her arms. She also claimed that she had never shaken or hit any of the twins. The officers urged Ada to tell the truth, as it could save Kyle's life, but Ada provided no further explanation. Given the circumstances, the officers reported the situation to their command and took Ada into preventive custody for further questioning. The investigation team arrived at the crime scene to examine the house. After completing their task, they informed Renee's friend, who was staying at the house on behalf of the owners, that they could clean up and organize everything for the family's return. While cleaning the house, the friend found a piece of adhesive tape sticking out from the door of a cabinet under the kitchen island. When they opened the door, they noticed it was broken and held together by tape. As a result, opening it caused the door to become misaligned. They simply placed it back and secured it with the tape, but found it strange because Renee was always careful with broken items to prevent the children from getting hurt. They had a hunch and called the police to report the door. Shortly after, investigators returned to collect potential evidence. Later, when questioned about the cabinet door, Renee stated that she frequently used that door and had never seen it held with adhesive tape. By the time Friday, October 14th arrived, all of Mike and Renee's hopes had vanished. The doctors informed them that Kyle was brain dead and had no chance of recovery. Amid unimaginable grief, the couple authorized the removal of life support, and Kyle passed away 3 days later on October 17th. The detectives interviewed Ada in prison, where she was accused of premeditated assault on a minor. This time, Ada claimed that the day before the incident, she was preparing the macaroni and cheese that Renee had requested. Kyle was sitting on the kitchen countertop, and the child fell, landing headfirst on the kitchen floor and hitting his head hard. Ada said she picked him up and checked for injuries. The only thing she noticed was redness on his ear and the right side of his head. So she applied cold compresses and gave him a pain reliever. When the interrogators asked why she hadn't told this to the other officers, Ada said she thought they wouldn't believe her. She mentioned that she didn't tell Renee because, when she arrived home from work, Renee complained of a severe headache. Ada said Renee suffered from migraines and had requested that the lights be turned off and the house be kept quiet. The interrogators asked if she had fallen with the child, which she adamantly denied. During that interrogation, Ada learned that Kyle had died, and she cried for the rest of the interview. Ada was brought before the courts, where a judge charged her with aggravated homicide and set bail at $750,000, which was beyond the means of Ada or her family. Consequently, she remained in custody until the trial. At that time, the police indicated that she might be charged with premeditated actions, which could carry the death penalty. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy on Kyle testified that when he received the child, Kyle was already unconscious. The examination revealed multiple hematomas, bruises, on the right side of Kyle's head, as well as bruises on the left side of his head, shoulder, and both arms. Additionally, there were 2 small hemorrhages forming hematomas on the right temple. These multiple areas of hematomas on Kyle's head indicated that he had suffered 3 separate impacts. The examiner noted that the bruises were relatively recent, with one possibly being 12 to 16 hours old. Internally, Kyle had brain and retinal bleeding, which is indicative of severe trauma. Although there were no broken bones, the brain tissue was notably swollen, and the pressure inside Kyle's head was 90 millimeters of mercury, significantly higher than the normal level of 20 millimeters. Based on these findings, the examiner concluded that Kyle had suffered severe traumatic events consistent with blunt force trauma, possibly from someone hitting his head against a hard object. The examiner suggested that the type of injuries could also result from shaking and swinging a young child's head against a solid object, such as a kitchen cabinet door. The crucial testimony of a forensic analyst revealed that the distance between the fasteners of the broken cabinet door in the kitchen matched the abrasion marks on Kyle's head. This expert also analyzed the adhesive tape used to repair the cabinet door and found 2 DNA traces, one of which had a greater contribution and matched Ada's DNA. The minor trace could not be identified. After hearing from the experts, it was time for Mike to testify. He explained that Kyle was doing well the evening of October 12th and the morning of October 13th with no bruises. He also mentioned that he made breakfast that morning, opened and closed the kitchen cabinets to get utensils and food, and that all the doors were in perfect condition, including the one that was later found with an unexplained taped repair. The parents said they had breakfast with the kids and played with building blocks, with the twins crawling around in a playhouse. Based on all the evidence, it was easily concluded that the events that led to Kyle's death occurred when there were no other adults in the house. The prosecutor in the case stated that the exact circumstances of what happened to Kyle may never be known with certainty, but according to the evidence presented at the trial, she outlined a possible scenario. Perhaps Kyle didn't want to eat his lunch and, feeling frustrated or distracted by watching a soap opera, may have gotten out of his high chair without realizing the cabinet door was open. The prosecutor speculated that Ada's rage could have provoked the violent attack on Kyle's head using the cabinet door until it broke, leaving marks on the child. After all the testimony and closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. When they returned, they decided Ada guilty of capital murder of a child under 6 years old. When the verdict was read, Ada's mother, Fernandez, who had traveled from Peru when her daughter was arrested, stood up and shouted that she would free Ada because she was innocent. She stated that there was no evidence to convict her daughter and swore to start over with an appeal. After the jury left, Kyle's parents showed photographs and videos of their late son and told about his short 14-month life, from birth to the last picture taken a few days before his death. Family members talked about Kyle, while others simply couldn't stop crying. Ada was convicted a year later in 2006 to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Ada and her family, giving up was not an option. Her parents immediately started a campaign to appeal the sentence, as they claimed that Ada's conviction was based on racism and ineffective public defense. But an appeal required money for legal representation and court costs, which the family did not have. In this case, Ada and her family have been continuously struggling to prove Ada's innocence. They are seeking support from various sources, including the Peruvian government, the Peruvian and Latino community in the United States, as well as solidarity organizations in Peru. In prison, Ada maintains her innocence and takes advantage of every opportunity for interviews. Their efforts have paid off, and in 2009, Ada's legal team filed an appeal citing 5 specific errors in the initial trial process. After reviewing the case, the appeals court rejected 3 claims but approved 2 claims. This was enough for the judges to overturn the verdict and cancel the trial due to irregularities. After this decision, Ada's family began fundraising efforts again to cover the $100,000 needed for a new trial. It took another 3 years to prepare for the new trial, which began on July 10, 2012, with the selection of 12 jurors from over 100 candidates. The defense maintained that Kyle fell from the kitchen counter on October 12 and sustained a head injury, and the situation worsened the next day when Ada, while running with the child in her arms, accidentally struck his head on the door frame. This time, the defense team presented testimony from a forensic expert with 40 years of experience. He suggested that some of Kyle's bruises may have been caused at the hospital during the insertion of a catheter to assess brain swelling. The prosecutor vehemently challenged this testimony. Another witness, an employee of the kitchen cabinet manufacturer, also testified for the defense, although he did not entirely rule out the possibility that Kyle's head could have hit the cabinet door. After the trial session was over, the jury deliberated for 5 hours, even requesting to listen to the 911 call recording again. Ultimately, They upheld the verdict. They once again found Ada guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case remains a deeply contentious one, with her family continuing to fight for justice, asserting her innocence amid claims of a flawed judicial process and insufficient defense. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Richard Beasley. Scott Davis, 48, relocated from South Carolina to Ohio after 15 years of work there. He sought a new job with higher pay to support his mother, who was facing financial difficulties. While searching, he came across a job posting on Craigslist that said, "We need someone to take care of a 688-acre property and feed the cattle. The position offers $1,300 per week, and you will live in a lovely 2-bedroom mobile home. Older, single applicants are preferred, but we welcome all candidates. This opportunity won't last long, so please apply immediately." Scott was drawn to the benefits highlighted in the job listing. Eager to find a good job, he planned to contact the employer soon. After hearing back from Richard Beasley, the person who posted the ad, Scott was quickly offered the position. They arranged to meet at Aeon's restaurant in Marietta, where Scott met Richard and his nephew, Brogan Raffi. They appeared to be genuine farmers, which made Scott feel comfortable and trusting. To earn Scott's trust, Richard arranged a preliminary interview with him. He proposed that Scott ride with him to the job site. They drove into a remote forest area where there was no cell phone reception. Richard suddenly asked Brogan, who was driving, to stop the car, saying that he needed to pick up some equipment for the farm near where they had shot the deer last time. After that, Richard and Scott exited the vehicle. Scott offered to help, and they began walking into the forest together. As they walked, Richard stayed behind Scott. Scott then heard a clicking sound and some mumbling from behind him. When he turned around, he saw Richard pointing a gun at him. Scott understood that he was the next target. Just as Richard was about to shoot, Scott quickly pushed the gun away, causing the bullet to hit his elbow. He then sprinted away while Richard pursued him, firing his weapon. Bullets zipped past Scott's head, and he heard trees and branches snapping behind him. "Oh God, he's going to kill me," Scott thought as he faced the revolver aimed at him. He was unsure of his destination, having never been to this place before, but that didn't matter. His main goal was to escape from Richard. Suddenly, Richard shot at him, hitting Scott in the arm and knocking him to the ground. However, before Richard could take another shot, Scott quickly got back on his feet and ran. Blood flowed continuously from his injured arm. In an effort to evade the gunfire, Scott veered to the right and slipped between two large tree trunks. He descended a small, slippery slope and almost lost his footing. It was autumn, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of leaves. Scott waved his arms to maintain his balance, ignoring the pain from his gunshot wound. He realized that falling could mean the end for him. As the ground leveled off and he began to run again, he heard the sound of a revolver firing again, right behind him. A bullet zipped past his head, just inches away. When Scott broke through the underbrush, he paused, disoriented and unsure. Dense trees and bushes surrounded him, nothing familiar to guide him. The murderer was closing in, crashing through the brush. There was no time to hesitate, he had to keep running. His legs trembled with fear as he heard the revolver fire again. The reality of his situation filled him with dread. He sprinted but stumbled, sweat blurring his vision. His head spun, and a loud ringing filled his ears. Exhausted, he finally stopped by a small ditch, hiding behind a tree to listen for the gunman. Scott felt the fear radiating from him as he groaned softly. His arm bled heavily, but he felt no pain. As his heartbeat steadied, he heard distant dog barks and crows cawing. He strained to listen for anyone searching for him, but the forest remained eerily quiet. After a long wait, he believed he had escaped and felt relief, but it took him 7 hours to feel safe enough to seek help. He eventually found the house and called the police, who arrived 15 minutes later. Scott recounted everything about the job listing, Richard, and the chase. He survived an 8-hour pursuit, but not all victims are so fortunate. He wasn't the first to apply for that job, hundreds had been hired before him. In August 2011, a 56-year-old man named Ralph Geiger faced hardship, unemployed and living in a camp in Aiken, Ohio. In August 2011, Ralph faced difficult circumstances after losing his job and having to move into a homeless shelter in Aiken, Ohio. He was determined to rebuild his life. After graduating from high school in the 1970s, he had moved to California to work with his father in an antique shop. He returned to Ohio in the late 1990s and started his own successful business, where he hired workers and earned a living by renovating homes and taking on various odd jobs. Unfortunately, when the economy entered a recession and the housing market declined, Ralph's business began to struggle. By the end of 2010, he realized he could no longer afford his rent, which led him to seek shelter in a homeless facility. Ralph lost his apartment and faced difficult times, but at least he didn't have the added responsibility of supporting a wife and children, as he was a lifelong bachelor. His close friend, Summer Rowley, who he considered like a daughter, is 26 years old. They have maintained a strong bond since he hired her to clean his house many years ago. Ralph has always been willing to help his friends. In the summer of 2011, Ralph visited the library every day to search for jobs online. By the end of July, he excitedly shared with Summer that he had secured a fantastic position managing a 600-acre livestock farm and taking care of the nearby houses. This job offered him a free mobile home and a weekly salary of $300. Summer was thrilled for Ralph and felt he truly deserved this new opportunity. Ralph appeared content as well, expressing that this job was a great chance for him to regain his economic independence. Ralph reached out to Summer on August 8, 2011, to inform her that he would begin his new job in Caldwell the following day. Summer wished him good luck and encouraged him to stay in touch. However, as days went by without any updates from Ralph, Summer became increasingly concerned. She attempted to call him multiple times, but each time she only reached his voicemail. By October, she learned that Ralph's phone number had been disconnected. Summer encountered someone else when she called Ralph's phone, which appeared to have been reassigned. Although she was concerned about Ralph, she didn't report him missing because she wasn't certain he was actually gone missing. Ralph had gone missing before but always returned. A similar situation occurred just weeks before Scott's case, involving 51-year-old David Pauley, who had faced difficult years. His marriage ended 2 years earlier, leaving him feeling unhappy and disillusioned. Starting anew in his 50s was particularly challenging for him. After his divorce, David found comfort in using his computer, often exploring various topics online. One night in October 2011, he came across an intriguing ad on Craigslist. In the Help Wanted section, he found a job listing for a farm caretaker to oversee a 688-acre farm in rural Ohio. The position offered a weekly salary of $1,300 and included the use of a free trailer on the property. David, who lived in Norfolk, Virginia, was curious and excited about a new opportunity. He thought taking a break from the city would be a big change, and rural Ohio, with its rivers, lakes, and wide open spaces, seemed like the perfect choice. Plus, having a free place to stay would help him save money. He responded to an advertisement and soon heard back. His twin sister, Deborah Bruce, kept in touch with him regularly. On October 22, 2011, David called her. He sounded very happy and excited as he shared the news about a job he found on Craigslist. He talked about a farm in Noble County, Ohio, and his dreams of starting a new life. His truck, filled with his belongings, was parked outside the motel. Deborah and David chatted for a while. Deborah wished her brother good luck and reminded him to stay in touch. David promised he would try, but he mentioned that there was no cell service at the farm. After they hung up, neither of them realized it would be their last conversation. Back to Scott's story, after Scott escaped a dangerous situation and reported it to the police, they tried to access the CCTV footage from the diner where he met Richard and Brogan. However, they encountered a problem. A fire had damaged the surveillance room the night before, making it difficult to recover the footage. The news reported on a man who posted a job ad on Craigslist. Instead of offering employment, he lured his victims into the woods and murdered them. This shocking story attracted significant media attention. Meanwhile, David's sister, who hadn't heard from him in some time, saw the news and contacted the police. They quickly determined that David was another victim of a man named Richard. The police searched the forest for clues related to an attempted murder of another victim, Scott. After 2 days, they found a baseball cap that Scott had dropped while running, and soon after, they uncovered a grave that had been dug for him. A K-9 unit was called in, and shortly thereafter, the dogs alerted the officers to something unusual. They discovered another body buried in the damp soil, which turned out to be David, who had been shot in the back of the head. A few days later, authorities discovered another grave with a body that lacked any identification. The sheriff's office in Noble County reached out to the FBI for assistance in finding out who had posted the job advertisement. They needed the FBI's help to trace the poster using the IP address and the advertisement's content. They determined that the job seeker was looking for someone very specific, someone who could vanish without drawing much attention. During interviews, if the applicant mentioned being married or having combat or martial arts experience, Richard would reject them. He was only interested in older men. He did not respond to any inquiries from women who applied. The victims, Ralph Geiger, David Pauly, and Scott Davis, fit the criteria set by the suspect. Another man, Timothy Kern, a 47-year-old divorced father living with his 3 sons, also matched these criteria. When he accepted a job in Ohio, he had to leave his sons behind. Timothy responded to the advertisement on November 10th, just 2 days after Scott Davis's incident. On November 12th, he visited his sons to say goodbye before heading to Ohio. After that, no one heard from him again. Once Timothy went missing, the investigation intensified. About 2 weeks later, the FBI traced the IP address of the ad poster to a house in Akron, Ohio, owned by a man named Joe. Joe claimed he didn't use Craigslist and that the ads were not his. He was unfamiliar with Richard but mentioned that a man had rented a room there. The police obtained surveillance footage from a diner, which showed a local man named Richard Beasley. When Joe viewed the footage, he recognized the man, but noted he had introduced himself as Ralph Geiger. The police were unaware that they had discovered Ralph, the first victim of Richard Beasley, buried in an unmarked grave. They also identified Brogan Raffi as Richard's accomplice and a high school student. Brogan was swiftly arrested and taken to jail. So who was Richard Beasley and why did he become a serial killer? Richard Beasley, born in 1959, grew up in Akron, Ohio, primarily with his mother, who worked in an office. After graduation, he became a mechanic but had a criminal history, serving 5 years in a Texas prison for burglary and another 7 years for weapon possession. He later returned to Ohio secretly, adopting a new identity. He created a facade of a compassionate man, pretending to be a pastor and going to church daily. However, his life took a turn when he became addicted to drugs following a car accident, and he eventually stopped working and lost his ability to earn money. Richard met Brogan at church. Brogan was the son of someone in Richard's motorcycle group. Richard decided to guide Brogan by discussing the importance of education and the dangers of drugs. However, despite his preachy attitude, Richard was actually involved in shady activities. He found an apartment near the street where he sought out vulnerable people, such as homeless people and drug addicts, to do shady things. The police eventually caught onto his schemes, forcing Richard to create a new false identity. He then shifted his focus to targeting homeless and unemployed individuals to steal their money and identities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Brogan agreed to testify against Richard and reveal everything he had done. Brogan reported that he witnessed Richard lead Ralph, the first victim, into the forest, which was the same location where Richard later lured David and Scott. In his report, Brogan described the incident, stating that on a hot summer night, they took Ralph into the forest. He mentioned that he walked ahead while Richard and the others returned to the car and that he didn't join them. He recalled that suddenly, there was a loud noise, prompting him to go back to the car to grab a shovel. When he returned, he noted that Ralph was still there and that Richard had put Ralph's clothes and personal belongings into a garbage bag. Richard dug a hole that was about waist deep and roughly 4 feet wide and that they had difficulty placing Ralph's body in it. Finally, he added that they sprinkled lime over him as a sort of ritual. After Richard took on Ralph's identity, he dyed his hair, changed his clothes, and trimmed his beard to resemble Ralph. He found a job and took pleasure in his new life. Many of Richard's victims would arrive with most of their belongings in their cars, which he later sold. Scott Davis had mentioned that he would bring his Harley motorcycle to the interview. Richard ultimately targeted Timothy Kern as his last victim. Timothy, 47, encountered the same job search difficulties as the other victims. He found a promising job opportunity, but it required him to move to a different location. Timothy was reluctant to leave his children behind. Since his divorce in 1997, he had kept a strong bond with his ex-wife and their 3 sons, who all lived in Massillon. As a dedicated father and passionate baseball coach, Timothy prioritized spending quality time with his kids. When he couldn't be with them in person, he maintained their family connections through social media, particularly Facebook. On November 10, 2011, Timothy posted on his Facebook wall about an exciting job opportunity to manage a large 680-acre farm near Cambridge, Ohio. The position offered him a truck, housing with all rent and utility costs covered, and a generous weekly salary. However, he was concerned about the farm's remote location, which had no mobile phone service. Although he was apprehensive about leaving his family, the opportunity was too appealing for Timothy to ignore. He got ready to move on Sunday, although feeling a sense of sadness about being away from his cherished children. On November 12, Timothy went to his ex-wife's house to say goodbye and collect some essentials for his move. He spent valuable time with his sons before leaving the following morning. One of Timothy's sons received a loving message from him, but nobody realized it would be their final farewell. Unlike previous victims, Timothy was taken by Richard to a different location behind an abandoned shopping center in Akron. Brogan dug the grave, and Richard shot Timothy in the back of the head. The police were unaware of Richard's address, but they eventually arrested him. Richard didn't realize that Joe, the landlord of his rental home, had contacted the police, who then used Richard's IP address to locate him. As a result, when Richard called and messaged Joe, it assisted the police in tracking him down. He was arrested on November 16, 3 days after killing Timothy. Richard faces charges for the murders of Ralph Geiger, David Pauly, and Timothy Kern, as well as the attempted murder of Scott Davis, along with numerous other charges. Richard Beasley and Brogan Raffi were tried in 2013 for the murders of Ralph Geiger, David Pauly, and Timothy Kern. Brogan Raffi had the opportunity to accept a deal for a lighter sentence by providing information about Richard, but he chose to decline. As a result, He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 3 counts of first-degree murder. Although Brogan remained silent, it was difficult to refute the evidence against him when Scott Davis, a key witness and victim, agreed to testify in court. There was also substantial evidence from the crime scene, including personal belongings and identification of the victims found at Richard's home. Despite his claims of innocence, the evidence clearly pointed to his guilt. Richard's trial took place later that year, resulting in the death penalty. He was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated robbery, and kidnapping. In 2020, Richard Beasley was retried after a procedural error was found in his 2013 trial. He returned to the Summit County Common Pleas Court for resentencing, but the outcome was unchanged. He was again sentenced to death and received multiple consecutive sentences for his other crimes. At 61 years old, Richard appeared via video from the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. He was sitting in a wheelchair next to his attorney, Don Hicks, and both were wearing masks during the sentencing. Richard's other attorney, Donald Gallick, argued via video that adding multiple consecutive sentences was unnecessary for someone already facing the death penalty. However, Assistant Summit County Prosecutor Jack Cor insisted that Richard's sentence should remain unchanged. Judge Kelly McLaughlin of Summit County Common agreed with the prosecutors, stating that multiple consecutive sentences were needed to accurately represent the defendant's criminal actions. During the trial, Richard inquired whether he could reclaim a Celtic cross that had been taken during the investigation. He mentioned that the necklace had been passed down in his family and expressed his desire to give it to his newly married daughter, insisting that it was unrelated to the case. He stated that there was no reason for them to keep it, emphasizing that it was the only thing his daughter would have from him. It was noted that it was ironic for a murderer responsible for taking the lives of many innocent people to portray himself as a caring father. It remains unclear whether his treatment toward his daughter was genuinely good or merely a facade intended to influence the jury's perception of him as compassionate and incapable of being the serial killer he was charged with being. His mother was there, trusting in his innocence. However, due to clear evidence, the testimony of the living victim, and the confession of his accomplice heard in court, Richard had to face the consequences of what he had done. When the sentence was announced, Richard's mother stayed quiet and didn't say anything more. Richard appealed the decision but was unsuccessful. Since the trial, he has repeatedly asserted his innocence, but no one believes him. He is currently imprisoned at the Chilo Correctional Institution in Ohio, waiting for his execution date. Richard almost managed to evade capture, but his gun jammed, which allowed Scott Davis to escape. Had Scott not escaped and reported the incident, it's likely that the serial killer in the woods would have gone unnoticed, resulting in many more victims. The story begins with an online job ad that the victims responded to without thinking twice. The key takeaway is to be careful when you see job postings online. Make sure to research both the job and the employer thoroughly to protect yourself from scammers or dangerous individuals. Hello, crime enthusiasts, are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Nancy DePriest. In February 1998, a visitor arrived at the office of the current governor of Texas. The visitor was a criminal who wanted to confess and cleanse his soul. He began writing letters to the police and the prosecutor's office, attempting to reach out to them for 2 years starting in 1996, but all his attempts were ignored. Eventually, he decided to write directly to the governor. In his letter, he confessed to a crime far more serious than robbery or rape. Over 4 pages, he detailed the murder of a girl named Nancy DePriest, which he had committed in 1988. He urged the governor to take his confession seriously, stating that he had become religious and wanted to confess. 2 men had already been imprisoned based on statements related to a crime they did not commit. Both were falsely accused and unjustly convicted. During the investigation, it came to light that 2 young men had admitted to the murder. while the true killer felt remorse for ruining their lives. He believed that the wrongful convictions were a result of police pressure, which he managed to evade. In 1998, this criminal wrote another letter to the prosecutor's office, confessing to the murder of a young girl and providing numerous details that only the actual murderer would know. The letter caught the attention of the governor, leading to the reopening of the case files to investigate the man's claims, as his conscience began to weigh heavily on him. Police started to re-examine all the case materials and discovered many inconsistencies. The story of the murder began in the year of 1988. On the morning of October 24th, around 9:30 a.m., the administrator arrived on Rent Street in Austin, Texas, to check on her employee, Nancy, who had not answered the phone. Nancy was a manager and was supposed to arrive early to prepare the food. Her husband drove her to the restaurant that day at 7:40 a.m. before going to work. According to the restaurant's schedule, Nancy's last contact with the owner was at 8:30 a.m., when she placed an order for ingredients that were running low. However, when the owner called Nancy at 9 a.m. to check if they were ready to open, Nancy did not answer. Her attempts to call back were met with silence. Worried, the owner decided to go to the restaurant, where she found the back door unlocked, water spilled on the floor, and the mixer running. Everything was eerily quiet, and Nancy was nowhere to be seen. The restaurant owner continued to search and found Nancy in the bathroom, surrounded by her own blood. Her head was severely injured, her eyes were glassy and unfocused. Fortunately, she was still alive, but her wrists were tied with her own bra. Panicked, the restaurant owner immediately called an ambulance. The ambulance arrived, found Nancy alive, and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors did everything they could to save her. Unfortunately, her injuries were too severe to save her. After discussing her condition with the doctors, Nancy's family made the heartbreaking decision to remove her life support. They chose to donate her organs, believing that Nancy would support this choice, ultimately helping to save the lives of many others. Forensic experts found that Nancy had been violently raped before she was shot in the back of the head. DNA evidence was collected from the crime scene and sent to the lab for analysis. The lead police believed that the motive for her murder was robbery, as the cash register from the day before was missing. A year earlier, multiple pizzerias in the Austin area had been robbed, but those incidents happened late at night or after closing hours, and there were no injuries, rapes, or murders. The thieves focused solely on stealing cash from the registers and the business's earnings. Nancy's murder was markedly different from previous robberies in the city. The police discovered multiple hair samples throughout the crime scene, including behind the counter and in the restroom. Her clothing was found in the sink of the women's restroom, indicating a struggle had occurred. The police considered 3 possible scenarios. First, Nancy might have forgotten to lock the front doors. Second, she could have known the perpetrator and willingly let him in. Third, he might have had access to the establishment and possessed his own key. Rumors about the murder of the pizza shop employee spread quickly throughout Austin, particularly affecting other Pizza Hut locations in the area. All employees were warned about the potential danger. This horrific incident shocked the community, from the victim's family to all Austin residents. Everyone was desperate to know who could harm Nancy, and the public urged the police to apprehend this perpetrator swiftly. Police investigated whether Nancy had any enemies. However, at just 20 years old, Nancy had no known connections to criminals and had never been in trouble with the law. She was a kind, well-liked person from Fort Worth, Texas, and well-known to the locals. No one expected her to be the victim of such violence. Just before the tragedy, Nancy had been married to Todd DePriest, who worked for the United States Air Force. At the time of her death in July 1987, the couple had a daughter, Sylvia. The employees at the restaurant where Nancy worked were stunned by her murder. They described her as a kind and friendly young woman who was happily married and deeply loved her family, including her husband and daughter. As a manager, Nancy was well respected by her colleagues, who viewed her more as a friend or sister. There were no complaints about her work ethic or leadership. Police first investigated the possibility that the attacker had a key to the restaurant. This led them to consider current and former employees, as all the pizza parlors in the chain had the same key system. This greatly expanded the pool of potential suspects. Police focused on the restaurant owner who discovered Nancy's body, but eventually discovered that everyone had an alibi and that there were no suspicious individuals among the employees. The main suspect initially considered was Nancy's husband Todd, but he had a solid alibi. After dropping Nancy off at work, he went directly to his own job, which ruled him out as a suspect. This left police puzzled about who could have attacked Nancy. Her family insisted she would never open the door to a stranger and always kept her doors locked, suggesting that the attacker was someone she knew. The police faced growing pressure from the local community, which was flooded with complaints and demands for a swift resolution. The public's fear heightened, particularly on November 9th, 2 weeks after the incident, when the restaurant on Rynn Street reopened. Pizza Hut's management instructed employees to monitor customers closely and to report any suspicious behavior immediately. On the same day, restaurant employees contacted the police to report 2 suspicious individuals. It turned out that these men were Christopher Ochoa, 22, and Richard Danziger, 19, who were employees of Pizza Hut at different locations. The security guard noted that they arrived in a car, parked in the lot, sat in a vehicle for a while, and then came inside to order beer. The 2 young men barely spoke and seemed to be examining the pizzeria suspiciously. When the security guard approached them, he was disturbed by their comments about the murder of Nancy. Christopher and Richard asked if there were any suspects in the case and questioned why there was no security present during the incident. The security guard then asked Richard where he was at the time of the crime, and he replied that he had been working at a different Pizza Hut that morning. Richard believes that there are multiple people involved in the case. The 2 men then raise their beer bottles in a toast, which seems odd to the security guard. The security guard then informs his colleagues of this unusual behavior, prompting them to contact the police with their suspicions. The police quickly identify the young men and check their alibis, which are confirmed. They could not have been at the pizza parlor where Nancy worked that morning. The conversation between the young men and the security guard is also revealing. It is possible that the young men were simply afraid for their safety, as they worked at similar establishments, which prompted them to discuss their concerns with the security guard. However, Christopher and Richard were immediately considered the prime suspects. This was likely due to public pressure and the lack of other suspects for the police. They were well suited to the role of the criminals, as they were likely acquaintances of the girls. They also had keys to the restaurant and had a reputation as good people. They did well in college and worked in a pizza parlor to support themselves, so their loved ones refused to believe that they were involved in the murders. A police officer, Sergeant Hector Palanca, joined the investigation. Hector had actually solved all of his cases. However, there were rumors that he could be less than professional and abused his position. Some claimed that he was willing to use the most extreme measures to obtain confessions. According to rumors, Hector repeatedly beat suspects to obtain confessions. While talking to Hector, Richard revealed that he had heard from coworkers that Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .2 pistol. He also mentioned that there was a girl's blue apron in the sink, which was blocking the drain and causing the restaurant to flood. Although this information spread quickly among the staff, the police officer found it highly significant. From that point on, the officer became convinced that Richard was the murderer. Hector thought that only the killer would know specific details, like the color of the apron, ignoring that all the staff wore the same uniform. However, aside from his suspicions, the police had no real evidence against Richard. Colleagues verified that Richard was working the morning of the murder, so he was soon released despite the suspicions against him. The police met Christopher at a pizza parlor in another part of town and then brought him to the station to discuss the case. Unlike the previous suspect, Christopher faced a much harsher situation. He was interrogated for hours using aggressive tactics. The officers attempted to intimidate him several times and warned him of the possibility of physical harm and the death penalty, which is legal in Texas. During the interrogation, Christopher cried and tried to prove his innocence, but this only seemed to strengthen the officers' resolve. Despite the intense pressure, the boy maintained his innocence and denied any involvement in the crime. The officers threatened to imprison Christopher with the most violent inmates at the Palenque institution, implying he would face sexual violence if he did not confess. In desperation, Christopher asked what he needed to do to avoid this fate. The police insisted that he admit guilt. Overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion, Christopher falsely confessed that his friend Richard had committed murder. The police recorded his statement. Afterward, Christopher was not allowed to leave. He wanted to go home, but instead, he was taken to the hospital for hair, blood, and other sample collections. Then, he was informed that he couldn't be released because he had signed a statement against Richard and was at risk. Christopher was placed in a hotel and was not allowed to leave his room. The next day, he was brought back to the police station, where they stated that they were certain he was involved in Nancy's murder. He was not a witness, but an accomplice. The nightmare begins again. This time, the police demand a confession from Christopher. He is forced to confess on tape. He repeats the story against his friend, which he was beaten into lying about during the first interrogation. Now, the police force him to say that at the time of the attack, he was also near the Pizza Hut where Nancy worked and was waiting in his friend's car. Of course, they are talking about Richard, who allegedly raped the girl, shot her, and stole the money. Christopher is denied a lawyer during the second interrogation. He has not eaten, drank, or slept properly for days. However, even at this stage, they force him to take a lie detector test. He is forced to answer yes or no questions, not knowing that it is all a scam. As a result of this test, the police falsely accused him of failing a polygraph test in order to further threaten him. Next, the police asserted that they believed he was still in the pizzeria during the massacre and actively participated in the crime. They alleged that the reason for the polygraph test was to prove that Richard was the mastermind behind the crime and that Christopher was his accomplice. Despite the police's insistence on his guilt, Christopher maintained his innocence. They then proposed a deal. If he revealed the truth about what happened, he would serve 60 years in prison instead of facing the death penalty. Additionally, Christopher was promised that if he behaved well in prison, he could eventually be released early. However, if he refused to cooperate, he would face the death penalty. Christopher's answers were recorded on a tape recorder. The police focused on getting a statement that suited their needs. They asked Christopher suggestive questions, suggesting how he should answer. During this time, the recording paused. Then, Officer Hector gave Christopher the answer he wanted and the recording continued. This process took a long time, and the exhausted Christopher continued to resist, although weakly, because he was mentally and physically exhausted. The police became angry and threw a chair against the wall. Hector decided to repeat a tactic he had used just a few days earlier. At that time, Hector brought a typewriter and typed up the statement needed to close the case. Christopher simply signed it. After a few hours, Christopher was taken to the county jail. Over the past 24 hours, he had been interrogated for over 20 hours and spent a week in solitary confinement. In reality, he was being held against his will in a hotel room. Somehow, the purported confession made its way to the police. Although it was clearly false, Christopher signed it, allowing the court to use it as a full confession to Nancy's murder. The document claimed that at approximately 7 a.m., Richard and Christopher went to the Pizza Hut. They had a .22 caliber pistol and used a key to enter the restaurant without any trouble. They found Nancy inside alone, tied her up, and attacked her several times. She was then shot once in the back of the head. Before leaving, they turned on the water to flood the restaurant and destroy the evidence. The day after his forced confession, on November 15th, Richard was arrested while visiting relatives. He was charged with murder and faced the death penalty. After his arrest, the police informed him that they had solved a brutal crime, claiming that the public could now feel safe. Police Hector and others pressured Christopher to give a statement, claiming that they had enough evidence to proceed with the charges. However, the only evidence they actually had was Christopher's confession, which was obtained through torture and psychological pressure. On November 21st, Richard's lawyer, hired by his family, worked hard to argue that the police had illegally obtained a confession. Afterwards, the prosecution began discussing DNA tests, which they claimed matched samples found at the crime scene. The analysis indicated that Christopher could not be ruled out as a potential source of the biological materials found on the Nancy's body. However, the test results did not prove his involvement. It's important to note that the accuracy of DNA testing in the 1980s was much lower than it is today. This meant that expert opinions at the time could not effectively establish guilt. Despite this, the evidence was still presented in the case. Richard maintained his innocence and struggled to understand why his friend Christopher testified against him. The prosecution claimed that a hair found in the pizzeria matched Richard's hair. However, the investigation's findings were inconclusive. The analysis concluded that the material collected was not a follicle, which also indicated that the reliability of the test was very low. The phrasing used in the report was identical to that for Christopher. While Richard could still be considered a potential owner of the found materials, it couldn't be definitively stated that they belonged to him, especially given the low accuracy of the results. This data strengthened the prosecution's argument. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's decision relied heavily on how the prosecutor presented their case. The troubles for the young men do not end there. Christopher's family cannot afford a lawyer, so Christopher is assigned a public defender. Christopher asserts in his defense that his confession was obtained under intense moral pressure from the police, which he finds intolerable. Unfortunately, the lawyer chooses not to investigate this complaint. Instead of defending Christopher's rights, he claims that the only way to avoid the death penalty is to plead guilty. Christopher is asked to testify against Richard. Surprisingly, the lawyer shows little interest in defending Richard and quickly aligns with the prosecution. He is so certain of Richard's guilt that he opposes the investigation and questions the forensic evidence. In a discussion with Christoph, the defense even mentions a witness who claims to have seen Richard at the crime scene, adding to the list of false accusations. Furthermore, the attorney reported that Christopher's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, so he threatened his client. In fact, the prosecutor's office did not find a gun at all. On April 6, 1989, Richard was charged with armed robbery and rape. For this crime, he could have faced a sentence of 5 to 99 years in prison. However, Christopher believed that the prosecution had shifted its focus and now considered Christopher the murderer, claiming that he had shot Nancy. In fact, the prosecution had enough evidence to convict Richard of murder. At his trial on May 5 of that year, Christopher followed his attorney's advice and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. His cooperation resulted in a life sentence, avoiding the death penalty. Richard's trial started on January 22, 1990, and it attracted significant public attention. The courtroom was filled to capacity, creating an intense atmosphere where attendees seemed eager for immediate justice against the defendants. They were brought to court wearing bulletproof vests due to concerns over potential violence. After hearing the testimonies, the jury deliberated for just 7 minutes before finding Richard guilty of rape and related charges, resulting in a life sentence. Nancy's family expressed satisfaction with the verdict. Over a year later, it was revealed that Richard was wrongfully convicted for a crime he did not commit. During this time, he had been the victim of a brutal attack, where he was severely beaten and suffered a serious head injury that required part of his brain to be removed. Although Richard survived, he was left disabled for life. At 22, he was moved to a specialized care facility where he received 24-hour assistance, as he was no longer able to care for himself. On that significant day, the leadership of the Austin police focused on Detective Hector Palanca. It became clear that he was abusing his powers systematically, as confirmed by other department employees. There was even video evidence of Hector torturing and physically abusing a suspect to force confessions. As a result, he was initially removed from his position. However, he was later reinstated and continued to harass both guilty and innocent individuals for many years. The damage caused by Hector to the law enforcement system is hard to comprehend. One case alone led to an innocent young man being sentenced to life in prison, while another victim was left permanently disabled. Shockingly, their cases remained unexamined until 1998. The Nancy DePriest case was long considered resolved, and no one had revisited it. This situation changed when Akeem Marina stepped in and sent a letter of confession to the governor, requesting that he reach out to the lawyers. Akeem's letter to the governor's office provided information that could help the police gather physical evidence. He claimed that the handcuffs and bag used in the attack could be found at his parents' home. In addition, the gun that shot Nancy had been confiscated during his arrest for other crimes. The police eventually took the letter seriously and began investigating the case. After reviewing the information, the police were able to confirm the criminal's claims. With more evidence in the archives, they approached Christopher, who was serving a sentence in prison. At first, Christopher was skeptical about the police visit and thought they might be trying to frame him for another crime. As a result, he chose to stick to the false story he had previously confessed to, a story influenced by Officer Hector, and did not provide any useful information. Eventually, Christopher discovered that the police wanted to talk to him because of a letter from Akeem in which Akeem had confessed to the crime. This news gave Christopher hope that he could prove his innocence and possibly be released. However, he no longer had faith in the justice system. In June 1999, he contacted a project called Innocence. In his letter, he explained his situation, and when activists from the project contacted the police, the district attorney reviewed the case documents. In August 2000, DNA samples were taken from Akeem, whose conscience was tormenting him. Multiple tests were conducted, the results of which clearly showed that Akeem had indeed raped Nancy, and that Christopher and Richard had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. A ballistics test confirmed that the shot that killed Nancy had been fired from the gun confiscated from Akeem. This news shocked everyone, including Nancy's family. Officer Hector Palanca was fired from the police force and retired, and it was eventually decided that the case would be re-examined. On January 16, 2001, a Texas court overturned the convictions of Christopher and Richard, whose lives had been irreparably damaged. In court, Nancy's mother sat next to Christopher's mother, holding her hand. During the trial, Christopher admitted that under pressure from Hector Palanca, he broke down and confessed to a crime he did not commit, dragging his friend Richard into the lie. Akeem, the author of the letter, testified at trial. He claimed that he killed Nancy because he was driven to human sacrifice by voices in his head. He admitted to stealing a work uniform from another restaurant and wearing it the day he knocked on the door of the Pizza Hut where Nancy worked. Believing that he was a coworker from the same restaurant chain coming to her aid, she opened the door without fear, where he then pointed a gun at her. He demanded money and took her into the bathroom, where he raped and killed her. Akeem testified that during the attack, he pulled out a gun and pointed it at the back of her head. According to his confession, he raped her 8 times before shooting her. During the trial, Hakim revealed that he had heard voices since childhood, but they completely disappeared when he converted to Christianity while in prison. He expressed a strong desire to atone for his sins and confessed to the crime. The prosecutor's office initially wanted him to face the death penalty but eventually asked for life in prison. The judge agreed, and Hakim received 3 life sentences. An investigation was then launched into the 3 police officers who questioned Christopher and Richard, but they faced no significant consequences. Christopher and Richard were eventually found not guilty, and their convictions were overturned, leading to their release. Their families were in disbelief. Christopher shared that he often cried at night in prison, unable to understand why he was there. Both men consistently claimed their innocence, yet no one believed them. The families of Christopher and Richard were furious about the unfair 12-year sentences, which had shattered their lives. Lawyers for the wrongfully convicted filed lawsuits, resulting in financial settlements. Richard received a total of $10.25 million, $9 million from the city, $1 million from the county, and $250,000 from the state. Christopher was awarded $5.3 million, and out of a sense of guilt, he donated $500,000 to Richard. Unfortunately, Richard's condition could not improve due to the traumatic brain injury he sustained. He required lifelong care and experienced mental health issues, along with partial recovery on the left side of his body. Richard spent his remaining days surrounded by loved ones who cared for him. He passed away from cancer in 2021 at the age of 50. Christopher was released after spending 12 years in prison. He pursued higher education and established a legal practice, offering many free consultations to those in need. Details about his personal life remain unknown. Hi everyone, thanks for returning. Let's unravel another perplexing mystery. The case of Brian King and Christina Benjamin. On July 29, 1993, it was a hot day in Alice County, Texas, USA. Despite the heat, a road crew was working on Cato Road to prepare the ground for asphalt. During their break, one worker leveling gravel spotted something unusual in the thick bushes across the Smith Creek River. The object, about 100 meters away, had a grayish color that made it stand out from the surrounding greenery. Curiosity prompted the worker and a colleague to climb over a barbed wire fence to investigate the mysterious object. As they got closer, about 10 meters from the object, a foul stench hit their noses. The stench became unbearable, and they covered their noses with their clothes. As they got closer, they discovered that the object was a corpse. It appeared to be a she, probably of school age. The gruesome sight showed torn flesh covered in flies, but the most shocking aspect was that the girl's head and arms were missing. The workers quickly notified their supervisor and decided to call the police. Without cell phones and far from the nearest town, they decided to leave one worker with the body while the other went to a small neighboring town to seek help. The police arrived shortly after being notified and began examining the scene for evidence and any dismembered body parts. However, a more gruesome discovery awaited them just 300 meters away. They discovered the body of a young girl and also found the body of a young man, who appeared to be about 15 years old. He was lying face down on the riverbank, about 10 meters from the bridge. Unlike the girl, he was still dressed and had not been dismembered. It appeared that he had been thrown into the river, and the current had washed him to shore. Retrieving the young man's body was much more difficult than accessing the girl's remains, so the police called the city fire department for assistance. With the help of special equipment, they were able to reach his body. Meanwhile, a team of forensic experts remained at the scene to investigate and collect evidence before it got too dark. Police worked the scene until the sun went down. They focused on the area where the bodies were found, and the medical examiner analyzed the victims. The expert determined that the first body, the girl, was that of a teenage girl who had been stabbed multiple times. She had been shot twice in the back with a .22 caliber gun, and her head had been severed from her body. It was likely with a large hunting knife or possibly an axe. The body showed numerous severe wounds on the abdomen, thighs, and genitals, with some resembling intricate hieroglyphs carved into the skin. There was a long, deep cut on the stomach, similar to those made during an autopsy. The criminal expert noted signs of extreme cruelty inside the cavity, including torn intestines and severed hands. Bruises that looked like marks from handcuffs suggested the victims had been restrained for a period before the torture started. Additionally, both of the girls' breasts had been removed. Experts believe the victims' bodies had been dead for 2 days, judging by their level of decomposition. He had been shot twice in the head with a similar weapon. There were no signs of a beating or struggle on his body. Police believe the attacker may have severed the girl's arms and head to make identification more difficult. However, he may not have realized that advanced DNA identification methods were available. However, the condition of the bodies and their decomposition could make this identification quite difficult. Forensic scientists found that the girl had been sexually assaulted. The high temperatures had caused significant decomposition, making it difficult to determine the exact details of the crime. Police believe the attack was carried out in anger or extreme hatred. However, the presence of fly larvae allowed researchers to determine a more precise time of death for both teens. The victims were tortured on the night of July 26th to 27th. To support their findings, the forensic expert consulted a forensic entomologist who studies the growth of insects on decomposing bodies and the damage they cause. Ultimately, the lab staff agreed that the time of death had been accurately determined. However, some errors regarding the timeline of the investigation had to be cleared up. Since the boy's hands and head were intact, forensic experts were puzzled as to how he escaped the same fate as the girl. They questioned why his hands were not cut off, as this would have made it easier for the criminal to conceal the victim's identity. The killer likely thought that the boy's body would be lost in the current or would drown, making it difficult to find. This might explain why he didn't dismember the body, or perhaps the body fell into the water by accident. The police believed that the dismemberment was not meant to mislead the investigation but might have been motivated by something more disturbing. Many serial killers keep trophies from their crimes. It's possible that the girl's head became part of such a gruesome collection because the attack resembled that of a maniac. The police's first goal was to find the girl's clothes. During their search, they found a clump of light-colored hair caught in the barbed wire that the workers had crossed. Police believed that this hair might have come from the decapitated victim. Unfortunately, the mutilated body had no identifying marks. However, in the boy's pocket, they found a book subscription card from a town registered to Brian King. They were able to confirm the details at the library, but it was closed for the night, so they would have to wait until morning. The next morning, the police station received a report about the disappearance of 2 teenagers from a small town, the same one where the library was located. The boy's name was Brian King, and the girl's name was Christina Benjamin. After receiving the report, police visited the boy's home and showed the wallet they had found to the father who answered the door. He confirmed that it belonged to his 14-year-old son, Brian, who was missing along with his 13-year-old stepdaughter, Christina, who had blonde hair. Days before the incident, around midnight, the children's father was awakened by a suspicious car that honked its horn and drove off. During this time, Brian was sleeping in a tent outside the house, which was unusual for a teenager. The car returned just 10 to 15 minutes later. The father noticed his son talking calmly with the driver and assumed it was one of Brian's friends. He spotted a man with blonde hair in the back seat but couldn't see the driver. Feeling reassured, he went to the bathroom. When he came back, the car and his son were gone. The father thought Brian had gone out with friends and planned to discuss this odd situation with him in the morning, so he went to bed. However, Brian never returned home, and it was later discovered that Christina had also disappeared. The parents started contacting friends and acquaintances of their children, but no one had seen the teenagers. The family had a younger girl who shared a room with Christina. She reported that on the night they disappeared, Brian entered their room and woke up Christina. He mentioned that some cool guys had arrived in a car and invited them to a party. Christina agreed, and they both left home together. Eventually, their parents reported the children missing to the police. They noted that before their disappearance, Christina had injured her foot during a school class. Upon further investigation, it was found that Christina's hair was on the forensic expert's desk. She had light hair, which was compared to strands found on a fence and those collected from home combs. The results showed that the hairs did not match, indicating they could belong to a likely killer, who also appeared to have light hair. With no evidence available, forensic experts had to rely on alternative methods. They discovered fibers on Brian's shoes that matched the material used in the carpets of Japanese cars. Brian's father provided a description of the car he saw, mentioning that it was dark in color. However, his description lacked detail, as he could not recall the specific model or license plate number. Police were particularly puzzled by the brutality that Christina had suffered. If this was not a personal hate crime, it would suggest they were dealing with a very dangerous person who was likely to commit further acts of violence. They speculate that the motive behind such cruelty could have been sexual. After interviewing the friends of the murdered teenagers, the police learned that on the evening of her disappearance, Christina was supposed to meet a man named Jason. All the witnesses who spoke to the police pointed to Jason Massey as the only person capable of committing such a crime. One of his friends revealed that Jason had long ago turned to a darker lifestyle. He had dropped out of school, never held a job, frequently killed animals, and kept their heads as trophies. Jason did not hide his disturbing interests. He once made a chilling comment, expressing enjoyment in saying that if a serial killer were active in the area, it would be him. Although he liked to boast about such things, people generally did not take him seriously. Jason was described as having long, curly blonde hair and was 20 years old at the time of these events. His mother was indifferent towards him, even hiding food in his room. The family frequently moved, faced evictions due to unpaid rent, and often lived in unstable conditions. Jason had a difficult childhood, living in a car and facing a harsh environment. He was addicted to alcohol and drugs, bullied weaker children and started harming animals. His father was also addicted to drugs and treated him badly. During Jason's school years, his father was incarcerated for a long time, but it had a serious impact on his mental health. Jason was involved in various petty crimes, including stalking. There was an incident where he killed a girl's dog because she rejected his advances, and he continued to stalk her, leaving her extremely scared. As a child, Jason loved his younger brother but grew to hate adults. As an adult, his feelings for women became entwined with violent fantasies. He also believed in ghosts and thought he could hear them speaking to him, influenced by religious stories told to him by his devout grandmother. The year the two teenagers were murdered, he was sentenced to 12 months in prison after a police officer discovered a dead cat and some suspicious cutting tools in his car. Unfortunately, he was released early and never faced the consequences of his actions. Police reported that when Jason was arrested, he was wearing handcuffs and appeared to be enjoying the situation. Jason did not resist arrest and confidently stated that he would be released soon. After searching his home, police found numerous newspaper clippings about the murders, a collection of adult videos, a box filled with handcuffs, and knives that had traces of blood. His room also contained books on satanic themes. In the Jason's car, a brown 1982 Subaru, forensic experts discovered what appeared to be blood stains, particularly concentrated in the trunk. They also found duct tape with light hair that did not belong to the Jason, a receipt for ammunition, a hunting knife, and a brown carpet with fibers matching those found at the crime scene. During questioning, the Jason denied any involvement in the crimes. He assumed he knew where the severed body parts were and even offered to lead the police to them. They searched the forest for several hours together but found nothing. After returning to the station, Jason requested a lawyer and stopped cooperating with the police. Soon after, the police received an anonymous tip suggesting that Jason was the only one who could be responsible for the teenagers' massacre. Later, a witness emerged who had spent much of the evening of July 26 with Jason. She stated that he had left home acting strangely aggressive, likely due to drug use. She noticed he had handcuffs and a gun, which made her uneasy, but she didn't report it to the police because she was afraid of him. The girl later said that Jason owned a .22 caliber pistol, the same type used to shoot the Brian and Christina, and that he had purchased ammunition shortly before killing the two children. DNA evidence from blood and hair found in his car matched the victims. Police gathered more and more circumstantial evidence linking Jason to the massacre, while he had no alibi. That evening, his friends and acquaintances found him strange, and some even felt afraid of him. A teacher from the school Jason attended said he was fixated on disturbing images, including satanic symbols. He often spoke about murders, which frightened some of his classmates. At that point, there was no solid evidence against him. To establish Jason's connection, the FBI was called in to create a criminal profile using photographs from the crime scene. During the investigation, it was discovered that Jason's mother had discovered several of Jason's notebooks the previous June. These notebooks contained disturbing content, including a list of girls Jason wanted to kill, with detailed descriptions of the violent acts he fantasized about. Christina was at the top of the list. The alarming nature of the diary prompted Jason's mother to seek help from a psychotherapy clinic after reading them. A psychiatrist assessed Jason and concluded that he posed a danger to himself and society, leading to his admission for intensive care and further observation. However, not all medical professionals agreed with the diagnosis of antisocial disorder. Most doctors, after conducting evaluations, opposed this diagnosis, resulting in Jason's release from the clinic without further treatment. Jason's writings became crucial evidence in the case, as they showed his obsession with thoughts of murder and torture directed at young girls for several years. He claimed that his desire to kill was motivated purely by sexual arousal. On March 17, 1994, Jason was charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder, yet he maintained his innocence. 3 weeks after the charges were filed, the hearings commenced. The prosecutor's office intended to pursue the death penalty for the defendant, which is permitted under Texas law. The hearing started on September 28, 1994. The prosecution alleged that in mid-July 1993, Jason confided in a friend that he had obtained ammunition, knives, and handcuffs, and that he had devised a plan to kidnap Christina from her home. He used Brian to entice both teenagers into a car, claiming they were going to a party. Once inside, he quickly disposed of the boy and shot him in the car. Christina attempted to flee, but he injured her, caught her, and proceeded to torment her. The prosecution worried that Jason could evade justice since the public defender argued that the investigation was biased. The police focused only on Jason as a suspect after hearing about a mysterious individual, neglecting to consider other possibilities. The defense lawyer pointed out to the jury that the evidence and assumptions made by the prosecution needed further investigation. Jason's sister testified during the trial, sharing details about their challenging childhood. They often attended school unwashed, beaten, and hungry. As a result, Jason struggled to focus on his studies, despite his efforts. However, her testimony backfired when the prosecution pointed out that, despite their hardships, his sister managed to lead a decent life without committing violence. This was argued as a reason why Jason's background couldn't justify his cruel actions. The prosecution's team included a forensic expert and a forensic entomologist who provided a thorough report on Christina's autopsy and the severe injuries she endured. Their findings indicated a brutal and unrestrained act of violence, suggesting that allowing Jason to leave the courtroom would be a grave injustice. One of the witnesses for the prosecution was Chris Nowlin, the same friend who was driving the car that transported the teenagers from their home. He chose to cooperate with the prosecution by testifying against Jason in exchange for immunity from criminal charges related to his involvement. Jason convinces his friend Chris to meet his girlfriend. Jason lies that he has been dating Christina since high school. When they reach a secluded area near a bridge, where Jason reveals his dark intentions to Chris. He plans to take Christina and Brian into the woods, kill them, and attack the girl. Chris dismisses Jason's words, as he often jokes about such things and never carries them out. Jason's former classmate testified that he had been stalking Christina for an extended period. After she rejected his advances in 7th grade, he killed her dog out of revenge and used its blood to stain her parents' car. The stalker also sent her disturbing photos of decapitated women, claiming this was how she would end up. A gun store salesman confirmed that he sold ammunition to Jason, which was later matched to the ammunition used in the murders. The day after the crime, Jason went to the wash to clean the car, but forensic experts discovered important evidence there. According to Jason's mother, he had joined a religious community shortly before the massacre, and she believed he was genuinely trying to change his ways. However, diary entries presented in court painted a different picture. They revealed that he was actually planning the crime. On the day of the hearing, a tourist was exploring the woods near where the teenagers were found murdered and stumbled upon an old, rusty refrigerator. Curious, he approached and opened the refrigerator and was horrified to discover 30 animal skulls inside. He also found 4 red and yellow skulls in plastic bags. The skulls were accompanied by diaries written in a strange, messy handwriting, titled The Book of Murders. The diaries, which began in 1989 and ended on the day of the 1993 murders of Christina and Brian, detailed his grisly experiments with animals and outlined his plans for Christina, which he then carried out exactly as described. He had previously made attempts to commit murder but had failed, which frustrated him. His violent urges were partly driven by his hatred for his mother and a desire to kill her. Additionally, his grandmother often told him stories about demons, which may have shaped his thoughts. This evidence led the prosecutor's office to conclude that Christina's murder was premeditated. Jason described himself as a killing machine in his diaries. After both the prosecution and defense delivered their closing statements, the jury began deliberating the verdict. After 3 hours, they found Jason Massey guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The next step was to evaluate the aggravating and mitigating circumstances to determine whether the death penalty was appropriate. The prosecution presented evidence from Jason's own diary, which detailed his gruesome actions, including the murders of 4 cats, 7 dogs, and numerous calves. He had a disturbing obsession with collecting animal heads as trophies. Testimonies from a few of Jason's friends revealed that he viewed acts of cruelty as a display of power and wanted to showcase it. The diary entries also indicated that he had no intention of stopping his violent behavior. One of his last entries expressed a desire to become the most notorious serial killer in the United States, claiming that he planned to kill over the next 20 years. It took the jury just 15 minutes to decide on the death penalty for Jason Massey on October 12, 1994. After the verdict was announced, the judge stated that executing Jason was a more humane option than what he had done to his victims. When Jason was taken to death row, he claimed that he had placed Christina's hands and head in a pillowcase along with her clothes and thrown them into the river. However, police were skeptical of his account, as he often kept trophies from his crimes. Jason was shocked by the conviction. He was determined to fight the verdict, so his lawyer filed an appeal on his behalf. Many advocates, including a Canadian coalition against the death penalty, spoke out in his support. Human rights advocates argued that the death penalty was inhumane and criticized the investigation, claiming that it was poorly conducted and ignored other potential suspects who were in the car during the kidnapping of Christina and Brian. Despite their efforts, their actions were ultimately in vain. On the evening of April 3, 2001, Jason was led to the execution chamber. For his last meal, he chose chicken legs, fried pumpkin, fried eggplant, mashed potatoes, green peas, boiled cabbage, corn, spinach with cheese, caramel fudge, pecans, ice cream, and a pot of sweet tea. Before his execution, Jason spoke to the victims' families, expressing his remorse for his actions. Hello, crime enthusiasts, are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Terry McAdams. The main character in today's story is Terry McAdams, a vibrant and active 22-year-old from Arlington, Texas. Since her teenage years, she enjoyed driving around the neighborhoods in her convertible. She often spent time in the city with friends, listening to music. Terry was a bright and popular cheerleader who always drew attention but remained modest and well-mannered. She deeply loved her sisters, Hopper and Pamela, and shared a close bond with all her relatives. Terry acted as a mentor for her sisters, bridging the gap between them and their mother. She enjoyed dancing with them and even taught them how to drive. Everyone who knew Terry described her as a person who loved life. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in the University of Arkansas. Before completing her degree, she decided to move to Arlington to be with her fiancé, Karen Anderson, who was a few years older and had already graduated. After graduation, she planned to start a career and marry Karen, who proposed to her. Since 1984, local newspapers have been reporting on the murders in the Fort Worth area. During this time, Terry was studying at university and took the threat very seriously. She was genuinely afraid for her life, a concern she shared frequently with Karen and family. To protect herself, Terry made several significant changes. She quit her well-paying job in Irving, where she had to drive every day and return home in the dark. Understanding the potential danger, she decided it wasn't worth the risk of driving at night. Despite being young and energetic, Terry began to live a very cautious lifestyle. She stopped going out at night, avoided parties, and only left her home during the day when accompanied by Karen. She even felt anxious about going grocery shopping and often called her mother multiple times a day to express her fears. Terry was genuinely worried about the situation, especially since the authorities had not yet identified the criminal, leaving the streets of Arlington feeling unsafe. Around the same time, Texas police bodies formed a task force consisting of experienced experts to look into a series of violent crimes and prevent further massacres. They believed that a serial killer, or potentially multiple terrorists, were active in the area. Terry felt particularly anxious because she fit the profile of the victims. They were all attractive, around her age, and lived nearby. It was difficult for her to cope, but Karen provided strong support. She admitted to her mother and sisters that being alone was the most frightening part. To help her feel safer, Karen decided to leave his job and accept a new high-paying position closer to home, though it occasionally required business trips to nearby cities. During her moments of panic, she limited her outings and rushed home after school. For any important tasks, she aimed to handle them early in the morning and always sought someone to accompany her. On the morning of February 13, 1985, the local police station received a disturbing call. An employee responsible for technical maintenance at the residential complex where Terry lived reported that he was unable to gain access to the apartment. When the police arrived, no one answered the door, and they were unable to reach the Terry's relatives. As a result, they decided to speak with local residents. Neighbors confirmed the repairman's account. They also could not contact Terry but reported hearing suspicious noises coming from her apartment. The police then decided to break down the door to enter her apartment. Inside, they discovered a gruesome scene. Terry's body was found in the bedroom on the bed. Terry had been raped and brutally beaten with a blunt object. Based on the condition of her body and the blood evidence, it seemed the crime took place at night or early in the morning before the police were called. Forensic experts quickly arrived at the scene to begin their investigation. It was clear that there had been a struggle and Terry had fought back. They found numerous defensive wounds on her arms and upper body, and her face was severely disfigured from a prolonged beating. There were signs of strangulation on her neck, but the forensic expert believes the attacker did not kill her that way. Instead, she died from a severe head injury. She also suffered brutal rape, but it is unclear whether this occurred before or after her murder. DNA traces were found on her bed linen and underwear, but at that time, it was not possible to identify the owner. The analysis methods were still developing and could not be used in the investigation. Additionally, there were no surveillance cameras or geolocation tracking available. The situation became more complicated when local people learned about the tragedy and needed psychological support. The robbery theory was quickly dismissed as many valuables were still intact in the apartment, including conspicuous items. It was clear that robbery was not the motive. The police began interviewing Terry's friends and relatives, looking for people who might have had personal motives such as jealousy, hatred, or revenge. However, Terry McAdams was known to be very kind, friendly, and non-confrontational, and none of her relatives could think of anyone who would want to harm her. Police searched the crime scene but did not find the murder weapon, which forensic experts believe was a hammer or a similar metal tool. They did discover a cigarette butt in the apartment, indicating it likely belonged to the killer. Unfortunately, the technology available at the time was insufficient to extract DNA from the cigarette, and the saliva remnants were too small to analyze. The only useful information obtained was the brand of cigarettes the killer used. One theory being considered is that a serial killer may be responsible for the crimes. Police have looked into Terry's murder and other cases in the nearby area and believe the suspect may not have known the victims and the attacks appear to have occurred spontaneously. The attacker aimed to avoid detection and leave no evidence behind. So he chose to enter through the back sliding balcony door instead of the main entrance. There were no clear signs of a break-in on the outer window frame. It is probable that he used a tree, growing a few meters away from the apartment building's wall, to reach the balcony. Unfortunately, aside from these basic observations, police were unable to gather any useful information. Police spoke with the family of the Terry, particularly her mother and sisters, who had the closest bond with her. They were all understandably shocked by the tragedy. Terry, known for her cheerful demeanor, seemed incapable of having enemies, especially ones who would wish to harm her so cruelly. Disturbingly, it appeared that Terry had a sense of impending danger. She was afraid to leave her home, fearing she could become a victim. Tragically, she was killed in her own apartment. As news of the attack spread throughout the city, the local community began to believe that there was a killer on the loose, capable of breaking into any apartment. They suspected that he might have targeted attractive women, stalked them, and attacked them. Ultimately, the community felt that no one was safe, especially young women who might be the next targets. Residents decided to take matters into their own hands. Over the next few months, gun and ammunition sales skyrocketed as more people began arming themselves. Meanwhile, public pressure began to mount on the police for answers. The county sheriff appeared on a local television station, asking anyone with information about the crime to come forward. After Terry's murder was reported on the local news, police received numerous calls, but the information did not help the investigation. Initially, Terry's fiancée Karen was considered the prime suspect, but he was away on business at the time and had an alibi. The police tried to include him in the murder profile to close the case and appease public concern, but this was not possible. Terry's friends could not believe that he could commit such a crime. After his alibi of being away on business was confirmed, he was removed from the suspect list. Police spoke with Terry's relatives to reconstruct a timeline of events that took place on February 12. Terry arrived at school around 4 p.m. After leaving the university, she got into her car and drove home. Once home, she changed clothes and went shopping, again alone. Although she usually liked to invite her friends along, they were all busy that day. First, she went to the nearest grocery store to buy ingredients for a cake she planned to make for Karen to celebrate Valentine's Day. He was scheduled to return from a business trip the next morning. Store employees confirmed that they saw Terry at the checkout and even provided a receipt for her purchase. The receipt confirmed that she had purchased ingredients for baking. They determined that she left the store at around 6:30 p.m. Police questioned anyone who may have seen her at the time, looking for any suspicious behavior, such as someone following her. However, no one reported anything unusual. It appeared to be a routine shopping trip. Terry paid for her items and walked out. Terry went home and decided not to go out again, as she had scheduled a visit from a repairman the next morning to fix some wiring issues. That evening, none of the neighbors were home, and those who did hear strange noises were unable to fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. The sounds faded relatively quickly, leading people to calm down. Typically, police would look for the killer among the victim's close acquaintances. However, this time it wasn't the case. A few months ago, Terry was preparing for her wedding. Karen had given her a $5,000 engagement ring, but the police were unable to find the ring during their investigation. Initially, it was thought that the ring's disappearance could be a robbery gone wrong. However, further investigation revealed that this theory was unlikely, as nothing else was missing. Given its value, a campaign was launched to find the ring. Approximately 250 flyers with a picture of the ring were distributed to local pawn shops, including those in Fort Worth and Dallas, informing them of the missing jewelry. Despite this effort, no one reported the ring to the police. The police followed up on all potential leads, but none of them came to fruition. All of the suspects questioned provided alibis. The police focused on people with a history of violence who lived in the area. However, the investigation began to stall. Terry's relatives made efforts to promote the case. They regularly reached out to the public through various media channels. They appeared on TV and radio and distributed many flyers, but their efforts yielded no results. Eventually, the murder of Terry McAdams became an unsolved case that was filed in the archives. The Terry's family continued to seek justice, but the police lacked the necessary resources and evidence to advance the investigation. The case went cold for 36 years until 2021, when a team of experienced police and forensic experts was assembled to revisit forgotten cases. Utilizing new technologies. Among these cases is that of Terry McAdams. Police used advanced DNA testing methods, allowing them to re-examine old evidence. Biological material from the perpetrator was found on Terry's underwear and bed sheets. She fought back during the attack, leaving traces of the perpetrator's skin under her fingernails. A cigarette was taken from the archives and sent for testing because the killer's saliva might be on it. This thorough analysis helped create a profile of a likely suspect. However, when this profile was checked against the database of known offenders, there were no matches. Terry's family hoped to find the killer who had been on the run for decades. Unfortunately, despite their hopes, the case remained unsolved for many more years. Fortunately, the investigation continued and eventually decided to use a new method, genetic genealogy technology, which required the assistance of the FBI. In August 2023, After exploring all possible options, the police department reached out to the Federal Bureau of Investigations in Dallas for help with the Terry McAdams case. They planned to analyze the DNA samples collected from the crime scene and the victim's body. This genetic testing aimed to create a family tree of the suspect, allowing the investigation to extend beyond the existing database, which only included known offenders. By using genealogical research, police could significantly increase the chances of identifying the suspect's relatives, particularly close ones. This method is considered very effective. At the time this study was conducted, the database had grown to the point where the probability of finding a match was close to 100%. The investigation was successful in identifying a man named Bernard Sharp, an American who had a notable history with the police in the 1980s. At the time of the crime, Bernard was 30 years old and married. He was also a neighbor of Terry, and Karen had a close relationship with him. During the investigation following the arrest, Bernard contacted the police and supported the victim's family. He provided an alibi that the police initially found suspicious, however. His wife later confirmed his alibi, leading to him being cleared of suspicion. Ultimately, all suspicions against him were cleared and the investigation continued without results. On the evening of November 3, 1985, a man called the police, claiming to be Bernard's wife's brother. He reported that he had been shot and needed assistance. After investigating, the police discovered that an armed criminal had attacked him, his sister, and her friend at their home. When the police arrived at the scene, it appeared to be a horrific massacre. He recounted that when he returned home with his sister and her friend, he found Bernard waiting for them with a gun. Bernard opened fire, killing the two women on the spot and wounding Bernard's wife's brother. Bernard's wife's brother was injured in the shooting but escaped to a neighbor's house. His injuries were not life-threatening. Bernard may not have expected his wife's brother to be there, and the shooting may have been premeditated. When Bernard realized his plan had failed, he began shooting at people. In addition to the two dead women, Bernard's wife's brother was also found wounded at the scene. Bernard was shot in the head and died from his injuries on November 3, 2008. Probably, the decision to voluntarily end his life was a factor in the tragic events that unfolded. It is now clear why the attacks on young girls in the city stopped after this tragedy. Bernard was a serial killer. During the investigation, no witnesses came forward to confirm his plans or his connection to the murders of Terry and the other girls. However, several close friends of Bernard's reported that he knew Terry's killer but did not name him. Several months after Terry's murder, Bernard was found dead after killing his wife and her friend, and seriously injuring his wife's brother. Police were unable to locate his body for an autopsy, so they had to take other measures to determine his connection to the murder of Terry McAdams. Police traveled out of state to meet with one of Bernard's registered relatives. Although the man did not want his name linked to the crime, he eventually agreed to provide a DNA sample. Forensic genealogy helped confirm Bernard's guilt. At the time of Bernard's death, police were unable to compare his DNA with the DNA found at the crime scene. They were unable to establish a connection between his previous attacks. Before killing his relatives, Bernard had only used violence and had not used a gun. Furthermore, Bernard's fingerprints were not in the police database, meaning that no matches could be found. Given the nature of the attacks, police suspect he may have been involved in other crimes in his neighborhood. He appears to fit the profile of a serial rapist and murderer. Bernard's criminal record has been turned over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an agency known for its crime-solving abilities. However, there has been no confirmed evidence of his involvement in any other cases. For Terry's family, identifying the killer brought them relief. After 39 years, the case was finally closed. This breakthrough was made possible by new technology. Terry's sisters appeared on a local television channel and shared their feelings about the case being solved through several interviews. After nearly 40 years, they say it would have been better to see justice in person. However, they take comfort in knowing that this dangerous criminal stopped his criminal ways long ago and cannot harm anyone again. If he had not stopped, many more innocent women could have been victimized by him over the years.